3 days after giving birth to my twins, my husband walked into my hospital room with his 25-year-old mistress, a $3 million check, and a contract demanding I sign away my children. He told me to take the cash and disappear because his dynasty only needed the heirs, not the incubator. I took his pen, signed the papers, and vanished into the night. What he did not realize was that I am a forensic accountant, and the document he so eagerly snatched back was about to cost him his entire empire. My name is Nora, 34 years old, and I just executed the most expensive revenge in corporate history. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that karma is best served cold and with a legally binding signature. The VIP maternity suite at Mount Sinai felt more like a luxury hotel than a hospital, but the physical agony of a traumatic twin delivery grounded me firmly in reality. It was my third day recovering. My body was battered, my surgical stitches burned with every breath, and my two beautiful babies were sleeping safely down the hall in the neonatal intensive care unit. I was lying in bed staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles, waiting for my husband Bradley to arrive for evening visiting hours. The heavy wooden door swung open, but Bradley was not alone. He strode into the room wearing a bespoke Italian suit, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that his wife had nearly died bringing his children into the world. Clinging tightly to his arm was Gemma, his executive assistant. She was wearing a skin-tight cashmere dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination, and her blonde hair was perfectly blown out. The scent of her overwhelming floral perfume instantly soured the sterile hospital air. I pushed myself up against the pillows, gritting my teeth to ignore the sharp pain radiating through my abdomen. I looked from Bradley to Gemma, waiting for a rational explanation for this absurd intrusion. Bradley did not offer one. Instead, he reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the foot of my hospital bed with a dismissive flick of his wrist. It landed with a heavy thud against my blanket. Right behind the folder, he dropped a cashier check. $3 million. I stared at the staggering numbers printed on the bank paper, then up at my husband of 5 years. "That is a very generous severance package," Nora Bradley said, his voice dripping with casual arrogance. "You will sign the divorce papers and the relinquishment of your parental rights today. You will take the $3 million, pack your bags, and leave the state by the end of the week. I get full physical and legal custody of the twins. You get a fresh start anywhere but here." I looked over at Gemma. She was standing next to my husband, a smug, victorious smirk playing on her glossy lips. She slowly ran a manicured hand over her own perfectly flat stomach, a silent, vicious taunt directed at my postpartum body. "You see," Nora Bradley continued, pacing the length of the hospital suite as if he were conducting a board meeting, "my father is preparing to step down from the company. The generational trust fund unlocks the exact moment I present him with male heirs. You served your purpose perfectly. You gave me the boys. But my dynasty needs a proper mother, someone who actually belongs in our world, not some middle-class accountant from the suburbs who works for a paycheck. We needed an incubator, and you performed admirably. Now it is time for you to collect your fee and exit the stage gracefully." Gemma stepped closer to the edge of the bed, her designer heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She looked down at me with an expression of faux pity that made my blood boil. "You should really take the deal, Nora," she said, her voice cloying and excessively sweet. "Bradley and I are building a real life together. The boys will have everything they could ever possibly want. Private schools, elite country clubs, a mother who actually understands high society expectations. You would just drag them down. Plus, $3 million is far more money than someone like you could make in a lifetime of crunching boring numbers. Think of it as winning the lottery." My hands clenched the edge of the thin hospital blanket. The severe physical pain radiating from my surgical incisions was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, calculating fury building deep within my chest. I glanced at the check again. $3 million. I knew exactly where that money came from. I knew which corporate shell company he had illegally drained to produce this cashier check without alerting his highly conservative father. Bradley was careless, profoundly sloppy, and entirely dependent on my professional silence. I took a slow breath to steady my elevated heart rate. The hospital monitors beside my bed beeped rhythmically, betraying none of the rage surging through my veins. "You want me to sell my newborn children to you?" I stated, keeping my voice entirely devoid of any emotional inflection. Bradley rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my lack of predictable hysterics. "Do not dress it up in dramatic soap opera terms, Nora. I am buying you out of a contract. Our marriage was a corporate merger that simply no longer serves my financial interests. The twins are the vital asset I am retaining. You get a golden parachute. Sign the papers. My legal team is waiting downstairs in the lobby, and I have an exclusive dinner reservation at 8 o'clock. He tapped his gold watch, signaling his impatience. He was so confident, so deeply entrenched in his massive privilege, that he did not even consider the possibility that I might fight back. He fully assumed my desperate love for my newborn children would be eclipsed by the sheer intimidation of his overwhelming wealth and societal power. But Bradley forgot one crucial detail about the woman he married. I was not just a docile wife. I was a chief forensic accountant who specialized in destroying corporate criminals. My successful career was built on finding the invisible threads of financial deception and pulling them until the whole sweater unraveled. I stared at the thick manila folder resting heavily on my lap. Inside those crisp pages lay the legal end of my marriage and the supposed permanent loss of my infant sons. But in my highly analytical mind, a completely different kind of contract was already being drafted. A devastating contract of absolute financial and personal ruin. "Well," Nora Bradley snapped, his sharp tone cutting through the sterile silence of the hospital room, "I do not have all day. Pick up the pen and sign the damn papers." I looked down at my hands, letting them tremble just enough to sell the performance of a broken, defeated woman. I kept my gaze lowered intentionally, avoiding eye contact so he could not see the sharp, calculating focus in my eyes. "Bradley," I whispered, injecting a slight pathetic waver into my voice. "This is happening so fast. I just gave birth to our sons. Please, just give me 5 minutes alone. 5 minutes to process this, to say goodbye to my old life, and I will sign whatever you want." Gemma scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh, please. Do not let her stall, Bradley. She is just trying to figure out a way to squeeze more money out of you." 5 minutes, Bradley said, holding up his hand to silence his mistress. He looked at me with an expression of profound disgust, clearly enjoying his perceived absolute power over my fate. "You get exactly 5 minutes to cry it out. When I walk back through that door, my lawyer better have a signed contract, or the golden parachute disappears, and I leave you with absolutely nothing." He turned on his heel and marched out of the VIP suite, Gemma trailing closely behind him like an obedient lapdog. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The second the latch engaged, my trembling hands went perfectly still. The tears instantly dried up. The facade of the devastated, discarded wife vanished, replaced by the clinical precision of a chief forensic auditor executing a meticulously planned operation. I threw the thick hospital blanket off my lap and ignored the searing pain in my abdomen. I reached over to my leather overnight bag resting on the bedside chair. Deep in the bottom zippered compartment, safely hidden beneath my maternity clothes, was a thick manila folder completely identical to the one Bradley had just tossed on my bed. Bradley thought he was pulling off a brilliant surprise attack. He thought he had outsmarted me. He had absolutely no idea that I had uncovered his affair with Gemma 6 weeks ago. I did not find out through a stray text message or lipstick on a collar. I found out the way I find everything out. I followed the money. While conducting a routine internal audit for his real estate empire, I noticed a series of irregular vendor payments routed through a subsidiary in the Cayman Islands. It took me less than 2 hours to trace those offshore funds directly into a luxury real estate holding company registered under Gemma's name. Bradley was embezzling millions from his own shareholders to fund a lavish lifestyle for his 25-year-old assistant. Once I had the financial proof of his infidelity and corporate fraud, I knew a dirty divorce was inevitable. I also knew Bradley would try to use his father's generational trust fund requirements to steal my children, so I hired the most ruthless, discreet family law attorney in the city. Together, we spent the last month anticipating Bradley's exact legal maneuvers. We predicted he would try to buy me off with a massive lump sum while demanding I relinquish my maternal rights. We were right. I opened his manila folder and pulled out the crisp legal documents. I quickly scanned the pages. It was standard aggressive corporate divorce boilerplate. He wanted full legal and physical custody. He wanted a non-disclosure agreement. He wanted me erased. I pulled my own prepared documents from my hidden folder. My lawyers had matched the exact font, the exact margin spacing, and the exact legal formatting of the firm Bradley used. Visually, the two contracts were virtually indistinguishable to the untrained eye, but legally, they were worlds apart. I slipped Bradley's original signature pages out and replaced them with my customized pages. I kept the front pages intact to maintain the illusion. In my version of the contract, the clause regarding the relinquishment of parental rights was completely deleted. Instead, buried deep in the dense legal jargon on page 3 was a clause stating that the $3 million cashier check was not a divorce settlement. It was legally defined as a voluntary repayment of undisclosed corporate debts owed to me for my forensic accounting services. By signing this specific document, Bradley was not buying my children. He was legally admitting to massive financial liabilities and surrendering the $3 million to me free and clear with zero claim to custody. Another hidden clause on page 4 stipulated that the signatory voluntarily surrendered all voting shares in his commercial real estate company to his spouse to avoid criminal prosecution for embezzlement. I clicked my pen and signed my name on the designated lines with smooth, confident strokes. I took the $3 million cashier check, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the secret pocket of my overnight bag. I slid the newly modified contract back into the original manila folder and placed it exactly where Bradley had left it on the edge of the bed. I leaned back against the pillows, adjusted my hospital gown to look appropriately disheveled, and forced my breathing to shallow, erratic pants. Exactly 5 minutes later, the door swung open. Bradley marched back in, checking his gold watch with a look of extreme irritation. "Time is up, Nora. Are we done here, or do I need to call security to escort you out of my hospital suite?" I looked away, feigning absolute defeat. I gestured weakly toward the manila folder. "It is done. I signed it." A triumphant, predatory smile spread across Bradley's face. He snatched the folder off the bed. His sheer arrogance and desperate desire to win blinded him completely. He did not bother to flip through the pages. He did not check the clauses. He simply looked at the back page, saw my signature in blue ink, and snapped the folder shut with a satisfying thud. "Excellent, Bradley," said his voice dripping with victory. "A smart business decision for once in your life." He turned to Gemma, grabbed her by the waist, and pulled her in for a deep theatrical kiss right in front of me. She giggled, wrapping her arms around his neck, shooting me a triumphant glare over his shoulder. "Get some rest, Nora," Bradley gloated as he turned back toward the door, tucking the ticking time bomb of a contract under his arm. "You are going to need your energy for packing. My private nanny will be arriving at dawn to collect the twins from the neonatal ward. I suggest you are gone before they wake up. It is best to make a clean break." Without waiting for a response, Bradley and his mistress walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the quiet beeping of the hospital monitors. The heavy door clicked shut for the final time. I sat up in bed, all traces of weakness completely evaporating from my posture. Bradley thought he had just executed the perfect corporate takeover of my life. He thought he had bought my children for $3 million and secured his father's trust fund. But my arrogant husband had just blindly signed a legally binding document that stripped him of his money, his company, and his leverage. Now I just had to make sure I was nowhere to be found when the sun came up. The clock on the wall read 8:15. I had less than 10 hours before Bradley would arrive. I swung my legs over the side of the hospital bed. Pain was a secondary concern right now. Survival was the only priority. I reached for my phone and dialed a number. It rang only twice. "It is done," I said. He took the bait completely. "Good," David replied. "Are you packed and ready to move?" "Yes," I answered. "I have the cashier check and the modified contract secured. I just need my boys." "I am initiating the emergency protocol now," David said. "I will be in your room in exactly 45 minutes. Do not open the door for anyone else." David was the chief of neonatal intensive care at this exact medical facility. When I first discovered Bradley embezzling millions and his sick plan to take my children, I went straight to my sister Claire and her husband David. They helped me construct the perfect escape route utilizing the very systems wealthy men like Bradley thought they could easily buy and manipulate. Down the hall in the NICU, David was already moving. As the chief physician, his medical directives were absolute law. He accessed the hospital mainframe and opened my son's digital charts. With swift keystrokes, he flagged both infants as experiencing sudden respiratory distress. It was a fabricated diagnosis, but one that legally required immediate specialized intervention. Using this fabricated medical emergency, David authorized an immediate hospital transfer. He officially ordered the twins to be moved to a highly classified pediatric center located 3 states away. It was a brilliant, untraceable ghost trail. He knew Bradley would use his immense wealth and legal muscle to bully the hospital administration into tracking us down. So David deployed his ultimate weapon. He invoked the strictest levels of federal privacy laws. He slapped a total medical and administrative blackout on my personal files and the twins' pediatric charts. He locked the digital records behind an executive firewall that only he possessed the security clearance to breach. If Bradley demanded information, the hospital staff would be legally paralyzed. They would face severe federal prosecution if they uttered a single word about our location or our medical status. David erased our entire existence from the hospital grid. At exactly 2 in the morning, the heavy door to my suite clicked open. David stepped inside. He wore dark blue surgical scrubs and carried a folded set of discharge clothing. He also pushed a sturdy transport wheelchair. "Time to go, Nora," he said quietly. "The transport team is in position." I dressed as quickly as my battered body allowed. I slung my overnight bag over my shoulder, feeling the comforting weight of the $3 million check and the modified contract. I eased myself into the wheelchair. David bypassed the public corridors. He wheeled me through a series of restricted staff hallways and secure service passages, utilizing his master keycard to unlock heavy doors that the general public did not even know existed. We reached the subterranean loading dock. The cool night air washed over my face. A private ambulance idled near the concrete freight bays. David had contracted a specialized medical transport team through his own private medical company, bypassing the hospital official dispatch system entirely. The paramedic opened the back doors. My heart surged violently into my throat. Inside, secured safely in specialized transport incubators, were my 2 beautiful baby boys. They were sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the massive corporate and familial war raging around them. I climbed inside, ignoring the sharp pull of my stitches. I reached out and rested my hands gently on the clear plastic of their incubators. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief finally spilled down my cheeks. They were safe. I had them. David stepped up to the back of the ambulance and handed the driver a thick, sealed envelope. "These are the mandatory transfer protocols and the strict confidentiality agreements," David instructed the driver. "You take the designated route. No stops. You do not speak to anyone about this transport. Understood, Doctor?" The driver nodded respectfully. David looked at me, his dark eyes filled with fierce, protective resolve. "Claire is waiting for you at the secure location. I will handle the massive fallout here in the morning when your husband realizes he has been played. Get some rest, Nora. The real fight starts tomorrow." "Thank you, David," I whispered, "for everything." He tapped the side of the ambulance twice. The doors swung shut, plunging the interior into a dim, secure blue light. The engine rumbled and we pulled out of the loading dock, slipping seamlessly into the quiet streets of the sleeping city. We drove for nearly 2 hours, winding our way out of the urban center and deep into a heavily wooded, affluent suburban district. The ambulance finally turned down a long, unmarked gravel driveway. We pulled up to a sprawling, modern cabin tucked away from the main roads. This was the safe house. It was a property owned legally by an obscure shell company under David Medical Firm, entirely untraceable to me or my sister. The front door burst open. Claire ran out into the crisp night air. My older sister was a fierce art gallery owner who protected her family with terrifying intensity. She helped the paramedics carefully unload the incubators and carry my sleeping sons inside the secure house. I walked through the door, the exhaustion of the delivery and the adrenaline of the escape finally catching up to my trembling legs. Claire wrapped her arms around me. "You did it," Claire whispered. "You got them out." I pulled back and looked at my sister, a cold, determined smile forming on my face. "I got them out," I confirmed, and I got his signature. I walked over to the rustic wooden dining table and dropped my leather bag. I unzipped the hidden compartment and pulled out the crisp manila folder. I laid it flat on the table, a physical manifestation of Bradley's impending destruction. In just a few hours, the sun would rise. Bradley would march into that hospital with his arrogant swagger, his hired nanny, and his cruel mother, fully expecting to claim his prizes. He would expect to find me gone and his legacy secured. He was going to find an empty room, a locked medical file, and a bank notification that would freeze the blood in his veins. Let him sleep for now, I thought, staring at the contract. Because tomorrow, his entire world was going to burn to the ground. The sun had barely crested the skyline when Bradley marched through the glass doors of Mount Sinai Hospital. He was flanked by his mother, Beatrice, wearing a pristine white Chanel suit entirely inappropriate for a hospital, and a private nanny, carrying a now completely empty double stroller. Bradley checked his reflection in the elevator doors. He looked like a man who had already won, possessing the careless swagger of someone who believed money could erase any inconvenience. "I cannot believe we are doing this at dawn," Beatrice complained. "That woman could not even have the decency to bring the children to the estate herself. Making us collect my grandsons like luggage is incredibly vulgar." "It is the fastest way to get her out of our lives," Mother Bradley replied. The $3 million check was more than enough motivation for her to vanish. "By the time my father wakes up, the boys will be in the nursery, and Nora will be nothing but an accounting error from my past." The elevator chimed. The trio stepped onto the VIP maternity floor. Bradley led the way toward the suite, pushing the heavy wooden door open, fully expecting an empty bed and some discarded hospital supplies. He got exactly half of what he expected. The room was completely empty. The overnight bag was gone, but the oppressive silence felt heavy, almost mocking. "Excellent," Bradley smiled. She actually listened for once. "Go down to the neonatal ward and collect the boys." He gestured to the nanny. "Bring them up here." The nanny hurried down the hall. Beatrice stepped into the room, looking around with visible distaste. "I will need to hire a decorator to redo the nursery," Beatrice sniffed. Nora had terrible taste. "We cannot have the heirs sleeping in a room painted that appalling yellow." "Do whatever you want, Mother." Bradley checked his phone. "The trust fund requires male heirs living under my roof by the end of the month. My father will finally step down, and the company will be entirely mine." Their victory lap was interrupted by rapid footsteps. The nanny appeared in the doorway, her face pale. The double stroller was still completely empty. "Mr. Bradley." The nanny stammered. "The nurses will not let me into the ward. They said there are no infants registered under your last name." Bradley let out a frustrated breath, marching down the hallway toward the intensive care unit. Beatrice followed closely behind her heels, striking the floor. Bradley approached the main security desk. "I am here to collect my sons," he demanded, slapping his designer wallet on the counter. "Open the doors and bring me my children right now." The charge nurse stopped typing. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice. What is the patient name?" "The twins." "My last name. Look it up." The nurse clicked her mouse. "I am sorry, sir. We have no patients currently admitted under that name." "That is impossible!" Beatrice shrieked. "Find my grandsons immediately." The nurse maintained her professional composure. "The patients you are referring to were formally discharged and transferred to another facility overnight." "Transferred?" Bradley yelled, slamming his hand against the glass. "By whose authority? I demand to see the medical director." "The biological mother authorized a specialized medical transfer," the nurse replied coldly. "Under federal privacy laws, I am legally barred from providing further information. Furthermore, a total administrative blackout has been placed on these specific medical files by the Chief of Neonatal Care." Bradley felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. A medical block? No one blocked him from getting what he wanted. "I will buy this entire hospital and fire you before lunch," Bradley threatened. "Give me the transfer location right now. If you continue to threaten staff, I will have security remove you," the nurse stated. "The medical block is absolute. You have no legal medical proxy on file." "Good day, sir." Bradley backed away, his mind racing. Nora had moved the kids. She had bypassed his security team and pulled a massive logistical stunt in the middle of the night. "We need to call the police." Beatrice panicked, grabbing his arm. "She kidnapped the heirs. Have her arrested." Bradley reached into his pocket for his phone, his hands trembling with rage and fear. He unlocked the screen to call his legal team, but a bright red notification banner filled his display. It was a high-priority alert from his elite private wealth bank. He tapped the notification. The banking app opened. The screen loaded, displaying his primary financial dashboard. The $3 million cashier check had been formally cashed at exactly 6 in the morning. But that was not what made Bradley's heart stop beating. Right below the cleared check notification was a flashing red banner. It read, "Access denied. Primary corporate accounts frozen pending federal review. Please contact your account administrator immediately." Frozen. His corporate accounts held hundreds of millions of dollars in operational liquid capital. They were the absolute lifeblood of his real estate empire. Bradley forgot how to breathe. He stared at the screen, his brain refusing to process the catastrophic financial failure unfolding in his hand. "Bradley, what is it?" Beatrice demanded. "Call the police." Bradley dropped his briefcase onto the floor. He frantically dug through the contents until his fingers brushed against the manila folder he had snatched from Nora's hospital bed the night before. He pulled the contract out. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn the crisp white pages. He flipped past the first page, reaching page 3. His eyes locked onto a thickly highlighted paragraph buried in the middle of the legal jargon. "The signatory hereby acknowledges that the $3 million payment rendered on this date is not a settlement for child custody. The signatory legally defines this transfer as a voluntary repayment for undisclosed corporate debts and forensic accounting services rendered." He flipped to page 4, his vision blurring. "Furthermore, the signatory voluntarily surrenders all executive voting shares in the primary commercial real estate holding company to the spouse to avoid criminal prosecution for corporate embezzlement." Bradley dropped the contract. It fluttered to the hospital floor, landing right next to his expensive shoes. She did not sign away the kids. She took his $3 million. She documented his financial crimes. She took his voting shares. She froze his accounts. She took his children. Bradley fell to his knees in the middle of the hospital hallway, letting out a raw, guttural scream as his entire empire collapsed before breakfast. Bradley scrambled up from the polished hospital floor, his expensive suit pants now hopelessly wrinkled at the knees. The raw, guttural scream that had just torn from his throat echoed down the sterile corridor, prompting several concerned nurses to peek out of nearby rooms. He snatched the modified contract off the ground and shoved it aggressively back into his leather briefcase. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He could not tell his mother what he had just read. If Beatrice knew he had blindly signed away the family empire, her relentless judgment would absolutely destroy him. "What is happening?" "Bradley." Beatrice demanded, her manicured hands gripping her designer purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Why are you screaming on the floor like a commoner? Call the police right this instant. That ungrateful woman has stolen my grandsons." Bradley ignored her frantic questions. His narcissistic brain was desperately trying to reframe the catastrophic failure into a narrative where he was still the victim and the ultimate victor. He could not immediately fix the frozen bank accounts or the surrendered voting shares without a massive legal war, but he could absolutely destroy the hospital that allowed his wife to slip through their fingers. He would sue them into oblivion, he would ruin careers, he would make them bleed for defying him. "We are not calling the police just yet," Bradley growled, adjusting his silk tie with shaking fingers. "We are going to the main lobby. I am going to have the medical director fired, and I am going to slap this facility with a kidnapping lawsuit so massive they will have to sell the building to pay for it." He turned and marched toward the main elevator banks, his heavy footsteps radiating pure, unadulterated rage. Beatrice followed close behind, her own sense of aristocratic entitlement fueling the fire. The private nanny wisely chose to slip away toward the cafeteria, wanting absolutely no part in the impending explosion. When the elevator doors opened into the expansive, sunlit main lobby of Mount Sinai Hospital, Bradley did not walk to the reception desk. He stormed it. The lobby was packed with morning visitors, outpatients, and medical staff grabbing their morning coffees. "I want the hospital administrator down here right now," Bradley bellowed, his voice booming across the cavernous room. "I want the chief of medicine and I want the legal department." Conversations stopped instantly. Dozens of heads turned to watch the wealthy man throwing a massive temper tantrum. The young receptionist behind the main desk jumped in her seat, her eyes wide with alarm. "Sir, please lower your voice," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "How can I help you?" "You can help me by getting your superiors down here before I buy this hospital and bulldoze it," Bradley shouted, slamming his fist onto the marble counter. "My newborn sons were kidnapped from your maternity ward in the middle of the night. Your incompetent staff allowed a mentally unstable woman to smuggle them out of a secure wing. I am initiating a $50 million lawsuit against this facility for gross negligence and child endangerment." Beatrice stepped up beside him, pointing a sharp, manicured finger at the terrified receptionist. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. We are major donors to the pediatric wing. We will pull our funding by noon. I will personally see to it that you are scanning groceries at a supermarket by tomorrow morning." Two armed hospital security guards began making their way across the lobby, their hands resting cautiously near their radios. The crowd of onlookers grew silent, and several people pulled out their smartphones, discreetly pressing record. Bradley did not care. He wanted an audience. He wanted everyone to know that he was a man of immense power who had been deeply wronged. Just as Bradley opened his mouth to unleash another tirade of legal threats, the heavy glass doors of the executive medical wing slid open. David stepped into the lobby. He wore a pristine white physician coat over a tailored navy suit. The embroidered letters on his chest clearly identified him as the chief of neonatal intensive care. David was a tall, imposing African-American man who carried himself with the kind of quiet, absolute authority that could not be bought with trust funds or country club memberships. He walked toward the reception desk with measured, deliberate steps. The crowd naturally parted to let him through. "Is there a medical emergency here?" David asked, his deep, resonant voice cutting effortlessly through the tension in the room. "Or are you just practicing your courtroom theatrics in my lobby?" Bradley wheeled around, his face flushed with rage. You are the one who put the block on my files. Remove it immediately and tell me where my children are." David stopped a few feet away from Bradley, completely unfazed by the aggressive posturing. "I am Dr. David Evans. And I do not take orders from you. Bradley sneered, looking David up and down with obvious disdain. His narcissism immediately sought the lowest, most prejudiced road available. He decided to attack David's professional credibility and his race, simultaneously leaning entirely on his privileged background. I do not care what your little embroidered jacket says, Bradley spat out, stepping closer to David to try and intimidate him. I know how elite hospitals work. They need to hit their diversity quotas to keep their grant money flowing. But you made a massive mistake getting involved in my family business. I play golf with the board of directors. I will have your medical license revoked so fast your head will spin. You will be lucky to find work as an orderly when I am done with you. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers in the lobby. Beatrice lifted her chin proudly, clearly approving of her son's ruthless approach. David did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He simply let Bradley's hateful words hang in the silent air, allowing the entire lobby and the recording smartphones to capture the pathetic reality of the man throwing the tantrum. Are you quite finished? David asked, his tone radiating absolute professional boredom. Bradley opened his mouth to shout again, but David moved first. He slammed a massive, thick medical file onto the marble reception desk. The sharp, heavy thud echoed loudly across the quiet lobby, making Bradley flinch. David rested his hand flat on the folder and looked Bradley dead in the eye. Let me explain the law to you very clearly, David stated, projecting his voice so everyone in the room could hear the absolute facts. The biological mother of those infants authorized a specialized medical transfer. Under strict federal health privacy regulations, she has sole discretion over their medical care. I am their father, Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. I have rights. David leaned in slightly, his expression turning into a mask of pure steel. You have absolutely nothing. I checked the legal system registry this morning. You have no medical proxy on file. You have no signed custody agreement. You do not even have a marriage certificate that supersedes a mother emergency medical directive. Legally speaking, in the eyes of this hospital, you are nothing but an angry bystander creating a security hazard. Bradley's face drained of color. He looked around the lobby. The crowd was not looking at him with respect or fear. They were looking at him with profound disgust. The cell phone cameras were still rolling, capturing the exact moment his untouchable facade shattered completely. You cannot do this, Bradley stammered, the realization of his powerlessness finally taking root. I already did it, David replied coldly. Now you have exactly 30 seconds to walk out of those front doors. If you do not leave my hospital immediately, I will have security arrest you for criminal trespassing and making terroristic threats against medical staff. I will happily provide the police with the security footage of your behavior today. Bradley stood frozen. His mother tugged frantically at his sleeve, suddenly realizing the massive social and legal disaster they had just caused. Bradley, we need to leave, Beatrice hissed, shrinking away from the glaring eyes of the public. Call the lawyers from the car. David signaled to the two security guards standing nearby. The guards stepped forward, resting their hands on their utility belts, waiting for the order to physically remove the trespassers. Bradley looked at the heavy medical file on the desk, then at David's unyielding face. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He could not buy his way out of this. He could not intimidate this man. He had lost. With his hands shaking and his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, Bradley turned around. He did not say another word. He walked stiffly toward the automatic exit doors, his mother scurrying nervously behind him. The once arrogant heir looked small and entirely broken as he stepped out into the morning sun, publicly humiliated and totally defeated. David stood his ground and watched them leave, his posture straight and proud. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction for protecting his family. He turned to the terrified receptionist, offered her a kind, reassuring smile, and quietly told her to have a wonderful, peaceful morning before walking calmly back to the elevators. The plush leather interior of the chauffeured Maybach offered absolutely no comfort to Bradley as they sped away from the hospital. He sat slumped against the door, frantically swiping through his phone, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He was locked out of everything. The corporate accounts, the payroll reserves, the emergency liquid funds, they were all completely frozen by federal banking authorities. He was effectively bankrupt, and he had no idea how to explain it to his fiercely demanding father. Beatrice sat rigid beside him, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes blazing with an icy, calculating fury. She despised seeing her son look so weak. She despised being humiliated by a hospital doctor even more. But most of all, she absolutely loathed Nora for daring to outsmart them. "Stop hyperventilating, Bradley," Beatrice snapped, slapping her designer clutch onto her lap. "We are not peasants. We do not panic. We leverage our resources. That little accountant thinks she has won because she played a clever trick with a contract. She forgets who holds the real power in this city. She is a postpartum mother with two fragile infants. We simply cut off her oxygen." Beatrice pulled out her own gold-plated smartphone and began scrolling through her extensive contact list. She wielded her high society connections like a weapon. Her first call was to a senior executive at the primary banking institution that managed Nora personal checking and credit accounts. Beatrice did not need a court order. She only needed to mention a pending federal investigation and a few vague threats about withdrawing the family massive investment portfolio. Within 5 minutes, every single one of Nora's personal bank cards was permanently deactivated. Her next call was infinitely more cruel. She dialed a board member of the private health insurance conglomerate that covered Nora and the twins. Beatrice fabricated a story about Nora committing severe insurance fraud and filing false claims. By the time Beatrice disconnected the call, Nora's premium health insurance policy was entirely suspended. "Let us see how long she lasts on the run with two premature infants and zero access to health care or capital," Beatrice sneered, slipping her phone back into her purse. "She will be crawling back to us by nightfall, begging for mercy." Miles away inside the secure, heavily fortified safe house, Nora was sitting comfortably in a plush armchair. She was sipping hot chamomile tea while watching her newborn sons sleep peacefully in their specialized transport bassinets. The morning sun streamed through the bulletproof glass windows, bathing the room in a warm golden glow. Her personal cell phone chimed on the side table. Then it chimed again and again. Nora picked it up and scrolled through the automated alerts. Her credit cards were declined. Her checking account was locked. A final email notified her that her health insurance coverage was temporarily suspended, pending an internal review. She did not panic. She did not even frown. She simply took another sip of her tea and smiled. It was such a predictable, uninspired move. Beatrice was playing checkers while Nora was playing three-dimensional chess. Freezing a personal checking account with a few $1,000s in it meant absolutely nothing when Nora had a $3 million cashier check resting safely in her bag. Across the room, Claire was arranging a stack of fresh blankets for the babies. Her own cell phone began to vibrate violently on the kitchen counter. Claire walked over and checked the caller ID. "Well," Claire announced, her lips curling into a sharp, predatory smile. "Speak of the devil. The wicked witch of the Upper East Side is calling me. She must have realized you are not answering your frozen phone." "Put her on speaker," Nora said, setting her teacup down. Claire tapped the green button and set the phone flat on the marble counter. "Hello, Beatrice," Claire answered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "What a surprise to hear from you so early in the morning. I do not have time for your cheap pleasantries." "Claire," Beatrice hissed through the speaker, her voice shrill and commanding. "I know exactly what is going on. I know you are hiding my daughter-in-law and my grandsons. You will tell me where they are right this instant, or I promise you I will destroy your life." Claire leaned against the counter, crossing her arms casually. "Is that a threat, Beatrice?" "It is an absolute guarantee," the older woman barked. "You run that pathetic little art gallery downtown, do you not?" "I sit on the board of 3 major cultural institutions in this city. I know every wealthy collector, every critic, and every socialite who buys art. If you do not hand over Nora and those babies within the hour, I will personally see to it that your gallery is blacklisted. I will ruin your reputation. I will spread rumors that you sell forgeries. You will be completely bankrupt and out of business before the end of the month. For a moment, the safe house was silent. Nora watched her older sister carefully. Then Claire threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine, mocking laugh that echoed brightly off the high ceilings of the cabin. Beatrice fell dead silent on the other end of the line, clearly shocked that her ultimate threat was being treated like a hilarious joke. "Are you out of your mind?" Beatrice demanded. "I will crush you." "Oh, Beatrice." Claire sighed, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. "You really should not threaten the person who handles your dirty laundry. Do you think Nora is the only smart sister in this family? My gallery does not just sell art. We do high-end appraisals for tax purposes. Remember those 6 contemporary sculptures you donated to the City Museum last December for a $2 million charitable tax write-off?" The line remained deadly quiet. "I know you remember them," Claire continued, her voice dropping into a lethal serious register. "Because we both know you bought those hideous metal scraps at a discount warehouse in Miami for $5,000. You begged me to inflate the appraisal value so you could cheat the government out of paying your capital gains tax. I have the original warehouse receipts, Beatrice. I have the emails where you explicitly instructed me to forge the provenance documents. I have everything locked in a digital vault." "You would not dare," Beatrice whispered. Her voice was completely drained of its previous arrogance. It sounded thin, hollow, and absolutely terrified. "If you ever threaten my business again," Claire stated with ruthless clarity, "or if you ever try to contact me, my husband, or my sister, I will bypass the local police entirely. I will send that entire encrypted file directly to the art crime team at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and copy the Internal Revenue Service. Tax fraud of that magnitude carries a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence. How do you think you will handle life in a concrete cell without your Chanel suits, Beatrice?" A sharp, gasping intake of breath was the only response from the phone. Claire leaned directly over the microphone. "Do not call this number again." She reached down and ended the call with a satisfying tap of her finger. Claire picked up the phone, walked over to her sister, and handed her a fresh cup of tea. The two women sat in the quiet safety of the cabin, listening to the soft breathing of the newborn twins. The noose Beatrice had tried so desperately to tighten around their necks had just violently snapped back, choking the life out of her own malicious schemes. Bradley paced the length of his lavish executive office, ignoring the panoramic view of the city skyline. His mother had failed. Her threats to Claire had backfired spectacularly, leaving Beatrice confined to her penthouse with a sudden severe migraine and an overwhelming sense of dread. Bradley was now entirely on his own, forced to handle a crisis he had never anticipated. He picked up his desk phone and dialed a highly encrypted number reserved for his most discreet fixers. He hired a team of elite private investigators, men who specialized in tracking corporate fugitives and recovering hidden assets across international borders. He gave them a single directive: follow the $3 million. In Bradley's arrogant mind, Nora was a predictable suburban woman who had stumbled into a fortune she could not comprehend. He fully expected her to leave a massive digital breadcrumb trail fueled by sudden greed. He assumed she would use the freshly cashed funds to book first-class international flights, purchase an exorbitant piece of real estate in a tropical location, or wire the money to untraceable offshore accounts. He wanted her tracked, cornered, and crushed the moment she swiped that debit card. Miles away from Bradley's frantic pacing, Nora sat cross-legged on the plush sofa of the safe house, sipping a cup of hot herbal tea. The twins were asleep in the adjacent room, their steady breathing monitored by state-of-the-art medical equipment David had provided from his private clinic. Claire was in the kitchen preparing a light lunch and humming a cheerful tune. Nora rested her encrypted laptop on her knees. She had successfully deposited the $3 million cashier's check into a newly established, highly secure trust account early that morning. The funds were fully cleared and available for immediate transfer. But Nora had absolutely no intention of keeping a single dime of that dirty money. As a chief forensic accountant, Nora understood the anatomy of dirty money better than anyone in Bradley's entire legal department. She knew exactly which shell companies Bradley had bled dry to produce that check. Retaining those funds would legally implicate her in his embezzlement scheme. It would tie her to his sinking ship and provide his high-priced defense lawyers with the perfect ammunition to drag her down with him in federal court. Bradley expected her to run and spend. He expected her to act like a desperate fugitive on a shopping spree. Instead, she was going to act like the ultimate corporate auditor. She was going to weaponize his own stolen wealth against him. Nora flexed her fingers and began to type. She bypassed standard banking interfaces, logging directly into the federal corporate tax portal using her still active administrative credentials. She navigated to the profile for Bradley's primary commercial real estate holding company, the very same company he had legally surrendered his voting shares for in the hospital room. She opened a specific, rarely used submission form. It was a form designated for voluntary corporate tax back payments. She linked the secure trust account holding the $3 million. In the payment amount field, she typed a 3 followed by 6 zeros, checking the digits twice to ensure absolute accuracy. She selected the option indicating the payment was an unsolicited correction for previously undisclosed domestic revenue. She did not leave a memo. She did not attach an explanation. She simply verified the corporate tax identification number, confirmed the routing details, and pressed execute. A small green checkmark appeared on her screen. The transaction was complete. $3 million of Bradley's illegally acquired cash was instantly vaporized from her control and wired directly into the deepest vaults of the United States Treasury. Nora closed her laptop, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over her as the screen went dark. She knew exactly what that specific transaction would do. The Internal Revenue Service relies heavily on automated algorithms to monitor corporate tax compliance. A sudden, massive, entirely unexplained $3 million voluntary back payment from a major real estate firm does not just raise an eyebrow. It sets off every alarm bell in the federal tax system. To the IRS algorithms, an unsolicited payment of that magnitude screams that the corporation is desperately trying to cover up a much larger systemic pattern of severe tax evasion and financial fraud. By wiring that money directly to the federal government under Bradley's corporate tax identification number, Nora had essentially painted a giant glowing bullseye on his entire empire. That single transaction bypassed lower-level administrative reviews and triggered an automatic catastrophic red flag within the Federal Enforcement Division. She had just handed the IRS undeniable, mathematically proven evidence that Bradley's company had been hiding millions in taxable revenue. A full-scale federal audit was no longer just a possibility. It was an absolute, unavoidable certainty. The private investigators Bradley hired would eventually trace the routing numbers. They would burst into his office with the tracking report, expecting to show him a luxury villa purchase or a flight to a non-extradition country. Instead, they would hand him a wire transfer receipt proving that his own money had been handed directly to the federal agents who prosecute financial crimes. There would be no retrieving it. There would be no explaining it away to his father. Nora leaned quietly back against the sofa cushions, closing her eyes and taking a deep, cleansing breath. She absolutely did not need his $3 million to build a beautiful life for her newborn sons. She had her own personal savings, her own brilliant career, and her absolute freedom. Bradley had tried to use his wealth to buy her submission, but Nora had just used his wealth to buy him a one-way ticket to a full-scale, devastating federal audit. The gears of government bureaucracy were usually slow, but in cases of massive corporate fraud, they moved with lethal speed. They were exceptionally thorough, and she knew they were officially coming for him today. Exactly at 10 o'clock the next morning, the polished glass doors of Bradley corporate headquarters did not just open. They were shoved apart by a dozen men and women wearing navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters IRS emblazoned across the back. They moved with the terrifying synchronized efficiency of a federal strike team. There was no polite inquiry at the front desk. There was no waiting in the plush lobby. They bypassed the terrified receptionist fanning out across the executive floor to systematically lock down every single computer terminal filing cabinet and server room. Bradley was standing by his corner office window shouting into his cell phone at his wealth manager when his heavy mahogany doors burst open. The lead federal agent, a stern woman with a clipboard and absolutely zero patience for corporate arrogance, marched directly to his desk. She slammed a federal search warrant flat onto his pristine leather desk blotter. Bradley dropped his phone, his jaw going slack. He demanded to know what was happening, threatening to call his elite team of lawyers, threatening the agent job, deploying the same tired intimidation tactics he used on everyone. The agent simply stared at him with cold, clinical detachment. She informed him that the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division was executing a full-scale raid based on a catastrophic algorithmic flag. She explicitly mentioned the unsolicited, entirely unexplained $3 million electronic tax payment initiated from his primary corporate account just hours prior. The payment, she explained, indicated a massive systemic attempt to conceal taxable revenue, prompting an immediate freeze of all physical and digital assets. The air in Bradley's lungs completely evaporated. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in his mind. Nora had not taken the money to run. She had used his own stolen capital to summon the federal government directly to his doorstep. She had weaponized his greed to trigger his downfall. The absolute magnitude of her forensic strike was paralyzing. Before Bradley could even formulate a coherent sentence to the federal agent, a shrill, panicked voice echoed from the hallway. Gemma pushed her way past two armed agents stationed at the office door. Her perfect blowout was a mess. Her designer makeup was smudged. She was clutching her luxury handbag like a life preserver. Gemma shrieked, ignoring the federal agents currently boxing up his hard drives. My platinum corporate cards were just declined at the jeweler. The bank teller told me my personal accounts are under federal review. What is going on? Tell them to turn my cards back on right now. Bradley stared at his mistress, a sudden sickening wave of realization crashing over him. The agents were listening to every word. Gemma, in her blind panic and absolute financial dependency, had just openly admitted to using corporate funds for personal luxury purchases right in front of federal investigators. "Shut your mouth, Gemma," Bradley hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the corner of the office. "We are being raided. The accounts are frozen. The feds are tearing the company apart because of Nora." Gemma ripped her arm out of his grasp. The sweet, supportive, adoring demeanor she had carefully cultivated for the past 2 years vanished instantly. Her face twisted into an ugly, vicious sneer. The mask was completely gone, revealing the ruthless social climbing opportunist underneath. "What do you mean Nora caused this?" Gemma demanded, her voice rising to an embarrassing pitch. "You told me you had her handled. You told me she signed the papers. You said you bought her off and she was gone forever. She tricked me," Bradley growled, pacing frantically like a caged animal. "She swapped the contracts. She took the $3 million and wired it to the IRS to trigger an audit. And worse, she took the twins. She hid them behind a federal medical block. I have no access to them. I do not even know what state they are in." Gemma's eyes widened in absolute horror, but not for the missing children. Her horror was entirely financial. "You lost the babies. Bradley, if you do not have those boys living in your house by the end of the month, your father will not release the generational trust fund. The $50 million will revert back to the board. We will have absolutely nothing. We have bigger problems right now than the trust fund," Bradley shouted, gesturing wildly at the agents carrying boxes of financial records out of his office. "We are looking at federal prison time, Gemma. Those offshore accounts you helped me set up in the Cayman Islands are going to be exposed. The fake vendor invoices we used to buy your penthouse are on those servers. We are completely ruined." "Do not you dare drag me into your sloppy accounting mistakes!" Gemma screamed, stepping right into his face. You promised me a life of luxury. You promised me high society. I wasted 2 years of my youth playing the supportive girlfriend to a man who is too stupid to read a contract before signing it. You let a middle-class suburban housewife completely outsmart you. Bradley felt a violent surge of hatred not just for Nora, but for the woman standing in front of him. The illusion of their grand romance shattered into a million jagged pieces. Gemma did not love him. She never loved him. She only loved the access he provided. The moment his limitless wealth was threatened, she turned into a venomous snake, ready to strike him to save herself. "You greedy parasite!" Bradley spat, his voice trembling with venom. "You gladly spent millions of my stolen money. You begged me to drain the company accounts to buy your designer clothes and your expensive cars. You are just as guilty as I am, and if I am going down for embezzlement, I am making sure the feds know exactly where every single dime went. You will be sharing a cell right next to mine." "Sir," the lead federal agent interrupted, her voice cutting sharply through their vicious domestic dispute. "We need you to step away from the desk and vacate the immediate premises. This office is now an active federal crime scene." Bradley looked around his sprawling corporate sanctuary. It was being dismantled piece by piece. His employees were watching from the glass walls, whispering to each other. His mistress was glaring at him with pure hatred. His wife had outmaneuvered him flawlessly, disappearing into the wind with his heirs and leaving him holding the bag for years of financial crimes. He needed a counterattack. He needed to salvage whatever voting power he still had to protect himself from his own shareholders. If the board of directors found out about the IRS raid before he could control the narrative, they would strip him of his CEO title by sunset. He brushed past Gemma, completely ignoring her shrill demands, and pulled out his encrypted secondary phone. He had to call an emergency shareholder meeting immediately. He would tell them Nora was mentally unstable, that she had orchestrated a hack to frame him. He would spin a web of lies so dense it would buy him the time he needed to destroy her. But as he walked out of the building and into the cold morning air, he had no idea Nora was already 10 steps ahead of his desperate plan. The mahogany-paneled boardroom on the top floor of the secondary corporate annex was a fortress of extreme wealth and absolute power. It was the only building the federal agents had not yet locked down. Bradley stood at the head of the massive obsidian conference table, looking out at the 12 men and 2 women who controlled the shareholder votes of his real estate empire. These were billionaires, hedge fund managers, and real estate tycoons. They were ruthless, pragmatic people who only cared about profit margins and mitigating risk. Right now, the risk was glaringly obvious. Whispers of the morning raid had already saturated the financial district. Phones were buzzing discreetly on the table. Bradley knew he had a rapidly closing window to seize control of the narrative before the board panicked and voted no confidence in his leadership. He needed a scapegoat, and he had the perfect one ready to be sacrificed. Bradley adjusted his posture, dropping the arrogant swagger he usually carried. He slumped his shoulders slightly, letting out a heavy, shuddering sigh. He looked down at his hands, playing the role of the devastated, heartbroken patriarch to absolute perfection. "Thank you for convening on such incredibly short notice," Bradley began, keeping his voice low and carefully laced with manufactured grief. "I know you have all heard the deeply concerning rumors regarding the federal presence at our primary headquarters this morning. I called you here to provide absolute transparency and to ask for your support during the darkest moment of my personal and professional life." He paused, letting the heavy silence fill the room. He looked up, making direct eye contact with the oldest, most conservative board members. "As you know, my wife Nora gave birth to our twin sons 3 days ago." Bradley continued, his voice cracking with expertly faked emotion. "What you do not know is that Nora has a history of severe mental instability. Following the delivery, she suffered a catastrophic postpartum psychotic break. The doctors warned me she was experiencing dangerous delusions, but I never imagined the sheer scale of the damage she would inflict on our family and this company." Murmurs rippled around the table. The board members leaned in, captivated by the scandalous personal tragedy unfolding before them. Bradley knew exactly how to play this crowd. He was feeding them the age-old trope of the hysterical, irrational woman, and they were swallowing it whole. In her delusional state, Bradley lied smoothly. Nora became convinced that the company was failing and that I was trying to harm our children. She orchestrated a massive, highly illegal breach of our financial systems. That unexplained $3 million tax payment that triggered the federal audit this morning was not an accounting error. It was a frantic, malicious act of sabotage committed by my mentally ill wife to frame me and destroy the legacy I have built. A prominent hedge fund manager at the end of the table frowned. Bradley, you are telling us your wife bypassed our dual authentication security protocols and transferred $3 million of liquid capital without triggering an internal alarm. Nora is our chief forensic auditor. Bradley reminded them, shaking his head with a look of profound betrayal. She designed the internal security protocols. She knew exactly how to bypass them. She weaponized her high-level corporate access against us. And worse, she has kidnapped my infant sons. She smuggled them out of the hospital in the middle of the night and has completely vanished. Gasps echoed in the boardroom. Bradley had successfully shifted the entire focus from his own financial crimes to a fabricated narrative of domestic tragedy. He was no longer the corrupt chief executive facing a federal raid. He was a tragic victim, a desperate father trying to save his children and his company from a madwoman. I am currently working with private investigators and medical professionals to safely locate my sons and get Nora the psychiatric help she so desperately needs, Bradley stated, straightening his posture to project strong leadership in the face of crisis. But my immediate responsibility right now is to protect this board and this company from any further sabotage. He gestured toward the heavy oak doors. Gemma stepped into the room. She had scrubbed the panic from her face, reapplied her makeup, and changed into a severe, highly professional charcoal suit. She carried a stack of thick legal binders playing the part of the dedicated, highly efficient corporate soldier. I need the board to take immediate legal action, Bradley demanded, his tone shifting from sorrow to decisive executive command. I need a unanimous vote to formally terminate Nora from her position as chief forensic auditor, effective immediately, citing severe medical incapacity and gross professional misconduct. We must legally revoke every single one of her security clearances, digital access codes, and shareholder rights before she can do any more damage. The board members exchanged nervous glances, but the logic seemed sound to them. If the chief auditor had suffered a psychotic break and was actively sabotaging the firm, immediate termination was the only viable corporate response. Furthermore, Bradley continued, placing a hand on Gemma's shoulder. I am temporarily appointing my executive assistant Gemma as the interim compliance officer. She has the institutional knowledge required to navigate the federal audit and clean up the chaotic mess Nora left behind in our servers. It was a brilliantly evil maneuver. By installing Gemma, Bradley was essentially giving his co-conspirator unrestricted administrative access to the company financial mainframes. Gemma would not be cleaning up any mess. She would be rapidly shredding every single digital invoice, offshore transfer receipt, and incriminating email before the federal agents could decrypt their restricted hard drives. They were going to burn the evidence and blame the missing files on Nora's supposed psychotic sabotage. I am prepared to do whatever it takes to assist the board and protect our shareholders during this unprecedented crisis, Gemma said, projecting absolute loyalty and calm efficiency. I have already begun drafting the necessary server purge protocols to isolate the compromised sectors. Bradley looked around the table. He could see the wealthy investors nodding in agreement. They did not care about his marriage. They only cared about protecting their stock portfolios from federal seizure. Bradley had given them a clean, highly believable scapegoat. He had successfully manipulated the room. He felt a familiar rush of arrogant adrenaline. He was going to survive this. He was going to wipe out Nora, secure the trust fund, and walk away completely clean. I call for an immediate shareholder vote, Bradley announced confidently, raising his hand. All those in favor of the immediate termination of Nora and the revocation of all her corporate shareholder rights, please signify by raising your hand. Bradley waited for the hands to go up. He waited for his absolute victory. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner was already standing right outside the door. Before a single board member could raise their hand, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open with such violent force that they hit the adjacent walls with a deafening crack. Nora walked in. She was not wearing a hospital gown. She was not crying. She did not look like a broken, mentally unstable woman suffering from postpartum delusions. She wore a tailored crimson-red power suit that screamed absolute authority. Her posture was flawless. Her expression was a mask of cold, unyielding calculation. Flanking her on either side were two sharply dressed men carrying thick leather briefcases. They were not medical professionals. They were senior corporate litigators from David's elite legal team men who destroyed monopolies before breakfast. Bradley froze, his arms still raised in the air. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. "Security!" he shrieked, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "Get security in here immediately! This woman is a danger to herself and this company. She is trespassing. Remove her!" Gemma backed away from the table, her eyes darting toward the exit. The confident facade she had worn moments ago shattered completely, replaced by the instinctual terror of a rat trapped on a sinking ship. She tried to hide behind a tall leather chair. The board members stared in stunned silence. The woman standing before them radiated pure rational competence. This completely contradicted the hysterical narrative Bradley had just spun. "Cancel that call to security," Nora stated, her voice echoing with commanding precision across the silent room. "I am a primary shareholder and the active chief forensic auditor of this corporation. I have every legal right to be here. In fact, I am the only person in this room who truly understands the catastrophic financial reality you are all facing today." Bradley slammed his hands on the table, spit flying from his lips. "Do not listen to her. She is delusional. She stole $3 million and kidnapped my children. I just called a vote for her termination. You are finished, Nora." Nora did not flinch. She calmly unclasped the leather portfolio she was holding. "I am afraid you do not have the necessary voting majority to terminate my position, Bradley. In fact, you do not have the voting power to order a cup of coffee in this building anymore." She pulled out the crisp manila folder. It was the exact same folder Bradley had tossed onto her hospital bed just 30 hours ago. She walked to the head of the massive mahogany table and dropped it right in front of the oldest, most ruthless hedge fund manager on the board. The heavy document landed with a loud, satisfying smack that made Bradley physically flinch. "I direct the board's attention to page 4, section 7 of this legally binding agreement," Nora instructed, her tone clinical and detached. "Read it carefully." The board members leaned in as the senior investor opened the folder. Nora did not need to read it. She recited the clause from memory, her voice projecting absolute power. "The signatory hereby voluntarily and irrevocably surrenders all executive voting shares in this commercial real estate holding company to his spouse. This surrender is executed in direct exchange for the spouse withholding immediate criminal prosecution regarding the $3 million offshore embezzlement scheme orchestrated by the signatory." Bradley felt the floor drop out from beneath him. A cold, suffocating dread seized his lungs. He stared at the folder, his mind flashing back to the hospital room. He remembered his impatience. He remembered wanting to get to his expensive dinner reservation. He remembered grabbing the pen, flipping straight to the last page, and aggressively signing his name without reading a single word of the fine print. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he had willingly placed his head directly into the noose. The senior board member adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the bottom of the page. "This bears your official signature, Bradley," the investor said, his voice laced with sudden dangerous hostility. "It is fully notarized and filed with the state. You signed away your entire voting stake. You handed her the controlling interest of this corporation. That is a forgery, Bradley screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Nora. She tricked me. She swapped the papers when I stepped out of the room. It is completely invalid. I will sue her. One of the ruthless corporate litigators standing behind Nora finally spoke, his voice dangerously smooth. The document was executed willingly and bears your authentic signature. If you wish to challenge its validity in federal court, you will be required to explain under oath why you were signing a $3 million payout to a shell company in the Cayman Islands while actively hiding assets from your own shareholders. We welcome that litigation. The threat hung in the air like a guillotine. If Bradley contested the contract, he would have to expose his own massive financial crimes on the public record, guaranteeing his own imprisonment. He was completely trapped in a legal cage of his own making. The wealthiest investor at the table, a man who had backed Bradley's father for decades, stood up and slammed his fist against the mahogany wood. "You absolute fool," the investor roared, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "You used our capital to fund your illicit affairs, and then you blindly handed the keys to the castle over to your wife because you were too lazy to read a legal document. You have endangered billions of dollars in assets." Bradley stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a leather chair. He looked at Gemma silently, pleading for her to intervene, to say something that could magically reverse the nightmare unfolding before his eyes. But Gemma was already calculating her own escape. She avoided his gaze entirely, pressing herself flat against the far wall, trying to become completely invisible to the furious executives. Nora stood at the head of the table, untouched by the screaming and the panic. She smoothed the lapels of her crimson suit, her eyes locked onto Bradley's terrified face. She had spent 5 years quietly auditing his messes, fixing his sloppy mistakes, and enduring his relentless narcissism. He had treated her like an incubator and a disposable asset. Now, as he collapsed into the chair, gasping for air, while his investors verbally tore him to shreds, Nora finally allowed herself a small, victorious smile. The king was dead, and the queen had just seized the throne without breaking a single sweat. The oppressive silence in the boardroom broke when Gemma finally realized that hiding against the far wall would not save her. The federal agents downstairs were already boxing up her fake invoices, and now the man who was supposed to protect her was weeping in a leather chair. Desperation mutated into a vicious, unhinged rage. She pushed herself away from the wall and lunged toward the center of the room, her designer heels sinking deep into the thick carpet. "You arrogant parasite," Gemma screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at Nora. "Do not act like you are some highly moral corporate savior. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter wife who could not keep her husband happy. You manipulated him because you knew he actually loved me. You knew he wanted to build a real empire with me. You are trying to steal the company that Bradley and I worked so hard to grow. Board members, you cannot listen to her. She is trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover out of pure spite and domestic jealousy." Nora did not raise her voice. She did not even blink at the barrage of frantic insults. She simply turned her back on the screaming mistress and walked over to the multimedia console at the head of the massive table. With fluid, highly practiced movements, she connected a small encrypted flash drive to the boardroom main projector. Gemma kept shouting, her voice growing increasingly shrill as she desperately tried to rally the stunned executives to her side. She spun a frantic narrative of true love and visionary corporate synergy, insisting that Nora was a domestic terrorist intent on ruining them all for no logical reason. "I think the board has heard enough about your romantic vision for this company," Gemma, Nora said, tapping a command key on the console. "Let us take a detailed look at your financial vision instead." The massive digital screen behind Nora flared to life. The room fully expected to see scandalous photographs, intercepted romantic emails, or expensive hotel receipts. They expected the messy, predictable evidence of a standard corporate affair. What they saw instead made every single billionaire at the table sit up straight in their chairs. It was a highly detailed, color-coded forensic accounting spreadsheet. Nora picked up a digital laser pointer. "While conducting my internal audit, I did not just find the $3 million Bradley was illegally hiding in the Cayman Islands. I found a much deeper, far more aggressive secondary extraction program running parallel to his clumsy shell companies. Nora clicked a button, and a new highly complex graphic appeared on the bright screen. It showed a complicated web of wire transfers originating from the absolute most sacred accounts in the entire corporation. These are the executive pension funds, Nora explained, her voice ringing with lethal authority. The untouchable retirement accounts specifically reserved for the senior shareholders and long-term investors sitting in this very room. For the past 8 months, someone with unrestricted administrative access has been quietly siphoning fractions of a percent from these highly protected funds and routing them through an offshore digital tumbler. The senior hedge fund manager stood up, his face turning an alarming shade of dark purple. Our pensions. You are telling me our personal capital was breached. Nora moved the glowing laser pointer to the final destination column on the right side of the screen. Over $4.2 million was systematically drained from your secure accounts. And it did not go to Bradley Offshore Holdings. It went here. The massive screen displayed a series of international routing numbers directly linked to 3 private high-yield banking accounts registered exclusively under Gemma name. The boardroom erupted into absolute, uncontrolled chaos. The wealthy investors began shouting, slamming their heavy fists on the mahogany table, their outrage entirely deafening. Stealing company revenue was a massive crime, but stealing their personal retirement funds was an unforgivable act of war. They demanded immediate arrests. Bradley stopped, gasping for air. He slowly lifted his head and stared at the massive digital projection above him. His bloodshot eyes tracked the routing numbers. He knew those specific accounts perfectly well. They were the exact ones he had personally helped Gemma set up to hide the allowance money he gave her. But the balance was supposed to be a tiny fraction of what was displayed on the glowing screen. Bradley realized the terrifying absolute truth. Gemma had not just been an eager, compliant accomplice in his massive embezzlement scheme. She had been actively using the unrestricted administrative access he blindly gave her to rob him blind. She was bleeding the company dry right under his nose, preparing to take the money and completely vanish long before the federal raid even happened. "You stole from me!" Bradley roared, his voice cracking loudly as he surged out of his leather chair. He lunged at Gemma, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her violently. "You greedy, treacherous thief! You told me you loved me. You told me we were building a beautiful life together, and you were stealing my entire safety net the entire time." Gemma shoved him away with surprising physical force, her face twisted in absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Do not touch me, you pathetic loser!" she shrieked right back into his face. "You think I actually loved you? You are a weak, completely incompetent man who relies entirely on his daddy trust fund to survive. I knew you were going to get caught eventually. You leave digital fingerprints everywhere. I was just taking what I deserved before your whole stupid empire crashed down around you today. I earned every single penny of that money having to pretend I could stand being in the same room as you." The grand true love narrative completely disintegrated right there on the expensive boardroom floor. The great corporate romance was exposed as nothing more than a transactional nightmare between 2 greedy, narcissistic predators who had ultimately turned on each other the second the stolen money was explicitly threatened. They screamed vicious insults, loudly trading horrible career-ending accusations, completely destroying whatever tiny shreds of human dignity they had left in front of the very powerful people who entirely controlled their immediate destinies. The room watched the magnificent fiery collapse. Nora stood perfectly still at the head of the table, observing the brutal fallout with cold professional satisfaction. She did not need to say another word to condemn them. The wealthy investors remained seated, absolutely mesmerized by the spectacular destruction of the disgraced chief executive and his treacherous assistant. It was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of her forensic brilliance. She had systematically dismantled their deceitful, greedy illusions, using nothing but their own arrogant mistakes against them. In the end, the $3 million deception had perfectly served its ultimate purpose, ensuring that the people who tried to destroy her family would forever be remembered only for their own complete catastrophic greed and spectacular professional failure. The screaming match between Bradley and Gemma finally sputtered out, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of two exposed criminals. The senior hedge fund manager, the man whose personal pension had just been systematically raided, remained standing. He did not yell. He did not need to. His quiet, lethal composure was far more terrifying than any shouting match. He turned his attention away from the pathetic display on the floor and looked directly at Nora. "Are those offshore routing numbers currently active?" The senior investor asked, his voice sharp and precise. Nora nodded once. "They are active, and I have already transmitted the complete digital ledger directly to the federal agents currently executing the search warrant at your primary headquarters. The federal authorities will freeze those specific accounts before Gemma can even reach the elevator. The stolen pension funds are mathematically traceable and fully recoverable." A collective sigh of relief washed over the boardroom. The wealthy men and women sitting at the mahogany table realized that Nora had not just exposed a massive corporate breach. She had actively contained it. She was the only competent executive left in the entire building. The senior investor adjusted his suit jacket and turned his lethal gaze toward Bradley. Bradley was still clutching the edge of the table, his chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack began to set in. "This corporation is currently hemorrhaging credibility," the investor stated coldly. "We have federal agents boxing up our financial history. We have a chief executive officer who has admitted to gross embezzlement. We have an executive assistant who has committed wire fraud against the primary shareholders. If the financial press gets wind of this internal chaos before we take decisive action, our stock price will plummet to zero by the closing bell. We must stabilize this firm immediately." He looked around the table, making eye contact with every single board member. "I call for an emergency immediate motion to formally strip Bradley of his title as Chief Executive Officer, effective this exact second. Furthermore, I motion to terminate Gemma for cause involving severe corporate theft and to legally hand all internal compliance authority over to Nora to guide us through this federal audit. Do I have a second?" Every single hand at the table shot up simultaneously. There was absolutely zero hesitation. Bradley watched in pure horror as his entire professional network, the men who played golf with his father, the people who had kissed his ring for years, unanimously turned on him in the blink of an eye. "Wait!" Bradley gasped, stumbling forward. "You cannot do this. My father built this company. I am the majority shareholder. You need my voting bloc to pass a motion of this magnitude." Nora stepped forward, her red power suit catching the light from the massive windows. She placed her hand flat on the manila folder resting on the table. "You were the majority shareholder, Bradley. But as we just established, you signed your executive voting shares over to me. I currently hold the controlling interest of this corporation, and I am officially casting your entire block of shares in favor of your immediate termination." The final nail in the coffin was struck. The motion carried with absolute legal certainty. Bradley was officially ousted. The empire he had inherited and subsequently destroyed was no longer his. "Security," the senior investor barked into the intercom on the table. "We need escorts to the top floor boardroom immediately. Bring boxes." Gemma let out a loud, pathetic sob. She dropped to her knees, reaching out toward the investors. "Please," she begged, her mascara running down her cheeks. "I will give the money back. I will cooperate with the feds. Just do not press charges. I am too young to go to federal prison." The board members looked at her with pure disgust. "You stole our retirement funds?" one of the female executives replied sharply. "You will be lucky if you ever see the outside of a concrete cell again. Get out of our sight." Two large corporate security guards burst into the room. They grabbed Gemma by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. She kicked and screamed, shouting terrible, desperate curses at Bradley as they dragged her out of the heavy mahogany doors. Her glamorous high society aspirations were completely obliterated, replaced by the grim reality of a lengthy federal indictment. Bradley did not look at her as she was dragged away. He could not. His physical body was failing him. The reality of his catastrophic losses was triggering a massive physiological response. He dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his chest. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and frantic. He was hyperventilating on the expensive carpet, his tailored suit soaking up his cold sweat. He looked up at the senior investors, his eyes wide and pleading. "Please," Bradley choked out. "Call my father. Let me explain it to him. He will fix this. Your father is a man of extreme discipline and absolute financial integrity." The senior investor replied, looking down at Bradley with zero pity. "When I call him in 5 minutes to explain that his son embezzled millions, failed to secure the generational trust fund, and triggered a federal raid, he will not fix this. He will disown you. You are a liability, Bradley. You are nothing." Nora watched the pathetic display for a few seconds. She felt absolutely no sympathy. This was the man who had treated her like a disposable incubator, who had tried to buy her newborn children with dirty money, who had plotted to leave her with nothing. Now, he was gasping for air on the floor, stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity. She calmly closed her leather portfolio and snapped the brass clasp shut. She turned to the board members, offering a professional curt nod. "I will be working from my private secure location, coordinating with the federal agents," Nora stated cleanly. "My legal team will forward you the necessary documentation regarding the voting shares and the compliance protocols." The board members nodded respectfully, viewing her not as a discarded wife, but as their ultimate financial savior. Nora turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, a steady, powerful rhythm of absolute victory. She did not look back at the man hyperventilating on the carpet. She simply walked out the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the ruins of his corporate empire completely behind her. Bradley dragged himself off the mahogany boardroom floor long after the senior investors had departed. His tailored suit was soaked in cold sweat, and his breathing remained ragged. He stumbled out of the corporate annex, avoiding the eyes of his former employees, and collapsed into the back of a waiting town car. He gave the driver his mother's address. He had nowhere else to go. The federal agents had seized his office, the board had seized his power, and Nora had seized his future. When Bradley arrived at Beatrice's sprawling penthouse, he found his mother pacing the marble foyer. She had already heard the catastrophic news through her high society whispers. The IRS raid was the talk of the financial district. When she saw her son looking like a defeated, broken shell of a man, her maternal instincts did not kick in. Only her survival instincts did. "You lost the company," Beatrice hissed, her voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceilings. "You let that middle-class accountant walk into your own boardroom and strip you of everything. You are a complete disgrace to this family name." Bradley poured himself a massive glass of scotch from the crystal decanter on the side table. "My hands were tied, Mother. She had the contract. She transferred the voting rights. The board turned on me the second they realized Gemma was stealing their pensions. I had no leverage left to fight them." Beatrice snatched the glass out of his trembling hand and slammed it down on a silver tray. "We do not have time for you to drown your sorrows, Bradley. The corporate empire might be temporarily out of our grasp, but the real prize is still on the table. The generational trust fund is still completely untouched." Bradley rubbed his throbbing temples, the alcohol withdrawal and extreme stress compounding his massive headache. "The $50 million. Exactly?" Beatrice snapped, her eyes narrowing with cold calculation. "Your father's 75th birthday gala is this Saturday at the country club. It is the absolute deadline. The stipulations of the trust are archaic, but explicitly clear. You must present your legitimate male heirs to the patriarch to formally unlock the capital. If you show up to that gala empty-handed, especially with these federal audit rumors swirling around, your father will completely disown you. He will freeze the trust permanently and leave us with absolutely nothing. We will be social pariahs in this city. How am I supposed to get the twins?" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Nora has them hidden behind a federal medical block. David is protecting her. I cannot even get past the hospital lobby without facing arrest. She holds all the cards right now. Beatrice walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the busy city streets below. "You leave Nora to me," she stated, her voice dropping into a lethal, venomous register. "That woman thinks she is untouchable because she knows how to read a financial ledger. She forgets that I have spent 40 years navigating the most vicious social circles in this country. I know exactly how to destroy a reputation, and I know exactly how to apply leverage." Beatrice walked over to her antique writing desk and unlocked a small velvet-lined drawer. She pulled out a sleek silver tablet. She did not need to hire private investigators or corporate lawyers for this specific task. She relied on the dark, unethical favors she had accumulated over decades of funding elite private clinics and turning a blind eye to the medical indiscretions of the wealthy. "I made a phone call while you were busy losing your company," Beatrice explained smoothly. "I reached out to a highly discreet physician who owes me his entire career. He was more than happy to manufacture a comprehensive, highly credible medical file regarding your stubborn wife." Bradley looked up, confusion mixing with a desperate glimmer of hope. "What kind of medical file?" "A tragic one." Beatrice smiled, her teeth gleaming in the soft light of the penthouse. "A highly detailed psychiatric and toxicology report. It thoroughly documents Nora's severe hidden addiction to prescription narcotics during her pregnancy. It also includes a fabricated DNA analysis suggesting that the twins were conceived through illicit affairs to feed her dangerous drug habits." Bradley stared at his mother. Even he was slightly taken aback by the sheer devastating cruelty of the fabrication. "If that gets out, it will ruin her life. The courts will take the babies away permanently." "That is the entire point," Beatrice snapped. "We do not actually need to publish it if she complies. We only need the threat of absolute social and professional destruction." Nora just secured a massive corporate victory. She wants to be a respected forensic auditor. If the national press gets a hold of verified medical documents labeling her a drug-addicted, adulterous, unfit mother, her pristine career will instantly evaporate. She will be utterly destroyed. Beatrice picked up her gold-plated smartphone and opened a secure messaging application. She typed out a message with rapid, vicious keystrokes, attaching the fabricated, highly authentic-looking medical PDFs. Miles away, inside the secure walls of the hidden safe house, Nora was sitting at the kitchen island. She was reviewing the initial emails from the federal investigators regarding the IRS audit when her personal cell phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number, but Nora instantly knew who was behind it. She opened the text. The words stared back at her, radiating pure, desperate malice. "Bring the twins to the gala this Saturday at 8 o'clock. You will hand them over to Bradley for the duration of the event so he can secure the trust fund. If you do not show up, I will release these attached medical records to every major news outlet and child protective service agency in the country. They detail your severe narcotic addiction and prove the babies are illegitimate. You will lose your career, your freedom, and your children. Do not test me, Nora." Nora clicked on the attached files. She scrolled through the fabricated toxicology reports and the fake psychiatric evaluations. They were incredibly thorough. To the untrained eye of a journalist or a family court judge, these documents would look absolutely devastating. They were perfectly designed to trigger immediate panic and total submission. Claire walked into the kitchen carrying 2 fresh bottles for the twins. She saw the icy, unyielding expression on her sister's face. "What is it?" Claire asked, setting the bottles down on the counter. Nora turned the phone around so Claire could read the message. "Beatrice is making her final move," Nora stated, her voice completely devoid of fear. "She is trying to blackmail me into bringing the boys to the grandfather's birthday gala to unlock the $50 million trust fund. She is threatening to release fake medical records to destroy my life if I refuse." Claire read the vicious text message, her jaw clenching with protective rage. She looked at the fake documents, recognizing the sheer danger they posed to her sister's hard-earned reputation. "What are we going to do?" Claire asked, her voice tight with anger. "We cannot let them get away with this type of extortion." Nora locked her phone and set it face down on the marble counter. She did not tremble. She did not shed a single tear. She simply looked toward the hallway where David had just appeared, having returned from his shift at the hospital. "We are going to go to a party," Nora announced, a cold, calculating smile spreading across her face. "Beatrice wants a public spectacle at the country club. We are going to give her exactly what she asked for." David picked up the smartphone from the marble counter, his eyes scanning the fabricated documents Beatrice had sent. He analyzed the psychiatric evaluations and toxicology reports with the precision of a seasoned chief physician. After a moment, he let out a low chuckle and tossed the phone back onto the island. "These are garbage," David stated flatly. "The medical terminology is outdated by a decade. The half-lives of the narcotics they claim you were using do not align with standard blood panel metrics for a postpartum mother. Any competent doctor would spot the inconsistencies in 2 minutes, but a journalist would not," Nora replied, her voice steady. "A family court judge dealing with a massive backlog of custody disputes might grant an emergency injunction before we could even hire experts to disprove it. Beatrice knows she does not need a conviction. She only needs the spectacle. The mere accusation of a mother doing narcotics while pregnant with heirs to a real estate empire would be a media circus. It would destroy my accounting firm before I even opened the doors." Claire slammed her hand against the counter. "So what is the play here? We cannot ignore it, but we absolutely are not handing over those babies so that twisted family can parade them around a country club like trophies." "I am not running," Nora said, looking at her sister and brother-in-law. "I spent 5 years fixing Bradley's messes quietly. I am done being quiet. If Beatrice wants to wage a war using medical records, we are going to respond in kind. But we are not going to use forged documents. We are going to use the absolute truth." David crossed his arms, his imposing frame commanding the room. If Beatrice was willing to weaponize fake health data to steal the children, it was time to deploy the heavily guarded secret Bradley had buried years ago. "I can get the real file," David said, his voice dropping into a lethal register. Bradley spent months in a highly exclusive rehabilitation clinic back in his early 20s. He managed to scrub his public record, but medical databases are entirely different beasts. "I serve on the Regional Medical Ethics Board with the former chief of that specific facility. They hate when wealthy families try to bribe their way out of clinical reality. Give me 2 hours. I will pull the verified, legally admissible records detailing his severe substance abuse and the permanent physiological damage it caused him." David did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked directly into the Safe House home office to begin making the phone calls that would unearth the single document Bradley feared most. With the medical counterattack in motion, Claire pivoted to logistics. The patriarch's 75th birthday gala was being held at the ultra-exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. Beatrice would undoubtedly have private security guards stationed at every single entrance with strict orders to deny Nora access. Walking up to the front door without an invitation was financial suicide. They needed an ironclad way inside. Claire pulled out her phone, her mind racing through her elite roster of art gallery clients. She needed someone with more prestige and social capital than Bradley's entire family combined. "I have the perfect key," Claire announced. "Richard Harrington. He is a billionaire venture capitalist and my biggest art collector. He hates Beatrice. She tried to humiliate his wife at a charity auction 3 years ago, and men like him do not ever forgive public slights. He is a platinum-tier member at Oak Ridge and one of the patriarch's oldest business rivals. He is attending the gala, and he always brings a massive entourage." Claire pressed the call button and raised the phone to her ear. Within seconds, the billionaire answered. Claire explained that she needed to secure 3 uninvited spots on his VIP guest list for the gala to execute a highly justified corporate and social retaliation against Beatrice and Bradley. Nora listened as Claire paused, letting the billionaire process the request. Then a predatory smile spread across Claire's face. "He is in," Claire told Nora, disconnecting the call. "He is adding us as his personal executive art curators. He said if we are planning to publicly humiliate Beatrice, he wants a front row seat." Security will not dare stop anyone walking in under his direct protection. They would risk a massive lawsuit and his immediate resignation from the club. Over the next 48 hours, the safe house transformed into a war room. David successfully retrieved the heavily encrypted, legally certified medical files regarding Bradley's past. He printed the thick stack of documents, placing them inside a sleek black leather portfolio. The file contained the exact irreversible medical diagnosis Bradley had paid millions to hide from his father. It was the ultimate indisputable proof of his deception. Claire arranged for a team of heavily armed private security contractors to guard the safe house. There was absolutely no chance Nora was bringing her newborn sons to a country club filled with hostile predators. The twins would remain entirely safe, locked behind bulletproof glass and armed guards while their mother went to war. On Saturday evening, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property. Nora stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom. She wore a striking, floor-length emerald green gown that radiated absolute uncompromising power. David walked into the room wearing a tailored black tuxedo. Claire followed, looking lethal in a sharp, asymmetrical black dress. David held out the black leather portfolio. "The files are organized," David stated, handing the portfolio to Nora. "The medical records, the forensic accounting summaries, and the proof of Beatrice's extortion text. It is fully loaded." Nora took the heavy leather folder. It felt like holding a live explosive. Bradley and Beatrice thought they could corner her with blackmail. They thought she was a vulnerable mother who would trade her children for her reputation. They were completely wrong. She looked at her sister and her brother-in-law. The three of them were a united front, ready to dismantle a corrupt dynasty from the inside out. "Let us go," Nora said, her voice colder than ice. "We have a birthday party to ruin." The caravan of luxury vehicles pulled up to the heavily guarded entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club. Richard Harrington, the billionaire venture capitalist, stepped out of his sleek vehicle and offered Claire a sharp, predatory smile. He was a man who thrived on high society warfare, and tonight he was providing the ultimate Trojan horse. Security guards in crisp, dark suits immediately recognized Nora from the frantic descriptions provided by Beatrice earlier that afternoon. Two large men stepped forward to block the grand entrance, raising their hands to halt her progress. Harrington did not even break his stride. He stepped directly in front of Nora, forcing the guards to abruptly stop or risk physically assaulting one of the most powerful men in the state. "If you touch my personal executive art curators," Harrington said, his voice quiet but dripping with absolute menace, "I will personally ensure this club loses its operating license by Monday morning. Step aside." The guards exchanged a panicked look, but they knew Harrington possessed the wealth and influence to completely destroy their employer. They slowly stepped back, lowering their hands and parting the way. Nora walked through the gilded doors, her emerald green gown sweeping across the imported marble floors. David and Claire walked firmly by her side, an unbreakable shield of family loyalty. The grand ballroom was a spectacle of excessive old money opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the frescoed ceiling, casting a brilliant light over hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites. Waiters in white tuxedos navigated through the sea of designer gowns and bespoke suits carrying silver trays of champagne. At the far end of this room, elevated on a raised platform, sat the patriarch of the dynasty. Edward was a harsh, unforgiving man whose entire life revolved around Bloodline's legacy and the $50 million generational trust fund he wielded like a weapon over his family. Edward looked deeply displeased. He was continually checking his pocket watch, clearly irritated that the highly anticipated presentation of his newborn grandsons had not yet occurred. On the stage next to the patriarch table, Bradley and Beatrice were stepping up to the microphone. Bradley looked visibly ill. His suit hung slightly loose on his frame, his face pale from the sheer terror of the federal audit currently tearing his corporate life apart. But he had no choice. He had to perform. He had to secure the trust fund tonight or face total ruin. Beatrice stood next to him, her posture rigid, her face plastered with a tragic, sorrowful expression perfectly calibrated for the audience. "Thank you all for gathering to celebrate my father tonight." Bradley began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom speakers. His tone was shaky, but he forced himself to project the image of a strong, burdened leader. "We had planned to introduce the newest members of our dynasty to you this evening. My twin sons." A murmur of polite anticipation rolled through the crowd. Edward leaned forward in his chair, his stern eyes narrowing at his son. However, Bradley continued, placing a hand over his heart. "We are facing an unexpected and profound domestic tragedy. Following a difficult delivery, my wife Nora suffered a severe psychological collapse. In her delusional state, she executed a sophisticated breach of our corporate accounts and fled the hospital. She has taken my children and hidden them from their rightful family." Gasps of manufactured shock erupted from the wealthy guests. People shook their heads, whispering about the tragic fragility of the human mind. Bradley was playing the victim flawlessly, feeding them a story that completely absolved him of any financial crimes and painted him as a desperate, loving father. Beatrice leaned into the microphone, taking over the performance. "We are currently working with federal authorities to safely retrieve my grandsons and get Nora the psychiatric institutionalization she so desperately needs." She lied smoothly. "It is a heartbreaking situation, but our family remains strong. We will not rest until the boys are brought home to their true legacy." Nora stood at the back of the ballroom, listening to the absolute fabrication pouring from their mouths. She felt David tense beside her, his massive frame vibrating with justified anger. Claire let out a soft, mocking laugh. "It is time," Nora said. She stepped forward, leaving the shadows of the entrance and stepping directly into the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. Harrington moved to the side, allowing Nora, David, and Claire to walk down the central aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Whispers rippled outward from the back of the room, growing into a loud, undeniable wave of confusion as people recognized the woman Bradley had just claimed was a missing, hysterical fugitive. Nora walked with the slow, deliberate pace of an executioner. Her emerald dress commanded the room. Her expression was completely devoid of fear, sorrow, or madness. She radiated cold, terrifying sanity. Bradley saw her first. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, the microphone slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. His eyes bulged in absolute panic. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be cowering in a safe house, terrified by the blackmail documents. Beatrice followed his gaze. When she saw Nora walking down the center aisle without the twins, her strategic sorrow vanished, replaced instantly by vicious, unadulterated fury. Nora had defied her. Nora was calling her bluff. In a moment of pure desperation, Beatrice decided to execute the nuclear option. She grabbed the microphone from Bradley, hands, her knuckles turning white. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Nora for the entire ballroom to see. "There she is," Beatrice shrieked, her voice amplified to a deafening volume, stripping away all pretense of high society elegance. "There is the woman who kidnapped the heirs to this dynasty. Security sees her immediately. She is a drug addict and a thief. She carries illegitimate children. They absolutely do not belong here." The echoes of Beatrice's vicious accusation bounced off the crystal chandeliers hanging over the paralyzed ballroom. Security guards stationed near the stage took an uncertain step forward, reaching for their radios to coordinate an immediate removal of the unwanted guests. Before a single guard could close the distance, David shifted his imposing frame. The towering physician moved with the calculated grace of a man who dealt with high-stakes emergencies every single day. He stepped slightly ahead of Nora, forming an impenetrable human shield. His dark eyes locked onto the advancing security team with such absolute commanding authority that the guards instinctively froze in their tracks. Nobody was ever going to lay a hand on her. Nora did not break her stride. She did not flinch at the hateful, slanderous words hurled across the crowded room by her desperate mother-in-law. She walked with her head held high, the emerald fabric of her gown flowing elegantly behind her with every confident step. The sea of wealthy elites expecting a hysterical breakdown from a supposed drug addict watched in total bewilderment. Nora was the very picture of terrifying composure. She reached the carpeted steps leading up to the main stage and ascended them smoothly, her eyes locked onto the people who had actively tried to destroy her entire life. Bradley stumbled backward, physically shrinking away from his wife. The sheer terror radiating from his sweating face completely destroyed the facade of the grieving, concerned husband he had so carefully projected just moments prior. Beatrice stood her ground for a second longer. Her mouth opened, preparing to scream for security into the microphone she held with a white-knuckled grip. As Nora stepped directly into her personal space, the older woman faltered. Nora did not yell. She simply extended her hand and wrapped her fingers firmly around the microphone. A brief, silent tug of war occurred. Beatrice was entirely hollow, running on nothing but pure panic and social desperation. Nora possessed the undeniable strength of the truth. With a sharp, effortless pull, Nora slipped the microphone directly from her mother-in-law's trembling hands. The audio feedback whined sharply for a split second before Nora adjusted her grip on the device. She looked out over the sea of upturned faces in the massive, opulent space. Hundreds of the most influential people in the city were holding their collective breath, their expensive champagne glasses completely forgotten. Nora spoke, her voice carrying an eerie, perfectly measured calm that immediately commanded absolute silence across the grand ballroom. "I apologize for the interruption to your evening," Nora began, her words ringing with sharp authority. "My husband spent the last 5 minutes spinning a highly dramatic fairy tale to explain why his corporate accounts were frozen by federal agents this morning. He told you I suffered a psychotic break. He told you I stole his money and kidnapped his children. He painted himself as a tragic victim to hide the fact that he has been systematically embezzling from his own shareholders for years to fund his private lifestyle." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The polite whispers erupted into a loud, frantic buzz of wealthy investors realizing their massive capital might be at severe risk. Bradley lunged forward, his face contorted in desperate panic. "Shut off her microphone," he shrieked, waving his arms wildly at the sound technicians stationed in the back of the room. "Turn it off right now. She is lying. She is completely out of her mind." Before Bradley could take another step toward Nora, David smoothly intercepted him. He did not throw a punch. He did not need to. David simply placed a massive, unyielding hand flat against the center of Bradley's chest. The physical disparity was staggering. Bradley was immediately halted, his expensive shoes slipping uselessly on the polished stage floor as he failed to push past the absolute wall of muscle and professional discipline standing in his way. "Stand down, Bradley." David warned, his voice low, but carrying a lethal, uncompromising promise. "You do not want to do this tonight." Nora completely ignored her husband's pathetic struggle. She turned her body, directing her full, unwavering attention to the raised platform at the far end of the stage. She looked directly into the harsh, judging eyes of Edward, the patriarch of the dynasty, the man who held the $50 million trust fund hostage, the man who cared only about preserving his prestigious bloodline at any brutal cost. Edward sat rigid in his high-backed velvet chair, his jaw clenched tightly. He had ruled this family and his vast business empire with an iron fist, for decades, demanding perfection and punishing failure with immediate financial excommunication. He looked at Nora, waiting for her to break under his intimidating glare. But Nora had faced down federal tax codes and untangled hidden offshore accounts designed by the best criminal minds in the country. An angry old man in a tuxedo meant absolutely nothing to her anymore. Nora stepped closer to the edge of the stage, maintaining intense, unbreakable eye contact with the patriarch. She raised the microphone again, her voice echoing with a devastating clarity that pierced the thick tension hanging heavily in the massive room. "Your wife is right about one thing," Edward, Nora announced to the completely silent ballroom. She pointed a steady, unshakable finger toward Beatrice, who was currently trembling violently near the wooden podium. Realizing that her ultimate blackmail scheme had just spectacularly backfired. The entire crowd leaned forward, utterly captivated by the unfolding spectacle. Beatrice just told this room that I carry illegitimate children. Nora continued, letting the profound weight of the words settle over the audience. She claimed that I am a deceitful woman who kidnapped the heirs to your precious real estate dynasty. Nora paused, her emerald gown catching the brilliant light as she stood victorious above the ruins of their lies. She held the black leather portfolio David had given her tightly against her side. The twins do not share Bradley bloodline, Nora stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a perfectly sharpened blade. She looked back at Edward, her expression completely unyielding as she delivered the final crushing blow. But it was not because of an affair. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. Not a single glass clinked, not a single silk dress rustled. Edward leaned forward in his velvet chair, his heavy brow furrowing in deep, dangerous confusion. He looked from me to his son, demanding a silent explanation, but Bradley was completely incapable of providing one. My husband was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just permanently snapped shut. I did not wait for Edward to ask his inevitable questions. I gave a brief, sharp nod to Claire, who had already bypassed the stunned security guards and slipped seamlessly into the audiovisual control booth at the side of the stage. She connected a secure flash drive directly into the primary projection system. A massive high-definition image instantly illuminated the main screen behind the stage, dwarfing the extravagant floral arrangements and the golden birthday banners. The wealthy elites in the audience gasped simultaneously. It was not a fabricated, sloppily typed extortion threat like the one Beatrice had tried to use against me. It was a legally certified, extensively verified medical diagnostic report from the most exclusive, heavily guarded rehabilitation and fertility clinic in the country. The official seals, the attending physician's signatures, and the stark clinical black and white text were entirely undeniable. Bradley let out a strangled, pathetic noise. He lunged toward the control cables, desperate to rip them from the wall, but David effortlessly caught him by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, hauling him backward with a single powerful jerk. David pinned Bradley in place, forcing him to stand and face the massive screen broadcasting his deepest, darkest shame to the entire social echelon he worshipped. "I want everyone to read the highlighted section very carefully," I announced, my voice echoing with terrifying authority through the ballroom speakers. I looked directly at Edward, making sure the patriarch absorbed every single word. This document was generated 12 years ago. It extensively details a profound history of severe chronic substance abuse during Bradley's early 20s, and more importantly, it details the irreversible physiological damage that lifestyle caused. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the crowd before delivering the fatal strike. The medical conclusion is absolute. Bradley has been completely and entirely sterile for over a decade. He possesses a 0% viability rate. It is biologically impossible for him to father a child. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek, covering her mouth with her hands. She had spent the last year bragging about her perfect grandsons, about the continuation of her pristine, superior lineage. Now her elite social circle was staring at the clinical proof that her son was a barren, deceitful fraud. Edward's face turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly the wood groaned. The bloodline he valued above all human life, the genetic legacy he demanded in exchange for his massive fortune, was a complete and total fabrication. He knew I continued, stepping closer to the edge of the stage, my voice ringing with righteous, unstoppable fury. Bradley knew he was sterile before he ever met me. But he also knew about the $50 million generational trust fund. He knew the absolute, uncompromising stipulation you placed on that money, Edward. He had to produce a male heir, or he would get nothing. I gripped the microphone tightly, channeling years of suppressed rage and silent suffering into every single syllable. When we decided to start a family, we went through the grueling, agonizing process of in vitro fertilization. I thought we were fighting a shared medical battle. but it was a carefully orchestrated nightmare. When behind closed doors the doctors confirmed what Bradley already knew, he did not offer me comfort. He offered me a terrifying ultimatum. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the sharp, shallow intakes of breath from the people standing in the front rows. He forced me to use an anonymous sperm donor, I stated, laying the ugly, brutal truth bare for the world to see. He threatened to destroy my career, to ruin my reputation, and to leave me with absolutely nothing if I did not comply. He forced me to undergo massive hormone treatments, painful procedures, and a traumatic twin delivery, all while swearing me to absolute secrecy. He made me carry children that he never actually wanted simply to create a convincing illusion for this family. I pointed directly at the trembling, defeated man pinned against the stage by my brother-in-law. He never wanted to be a father. He never looked at those beautiful baby boys with an ounce of love. He looked at them like lottery tickets. They were nothing but living, breathing financial props designed to trick you into unlocking a $50 million vault. Edward's chest was heaving. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect, the absolute betrayal by his own flesh and blood, was visibly tearing the patriarch apart. That is why he showed up to my hospital room 3 days after I nearly died giving birth. I concluded, my voice cold and lethal. That is why he threw a $3 million check on my bed and demanded I sign away my maternal rights. To him, it was just a business transaction. He wanted to buy the props, discard the incubator, and present the grand illusion to you tonight. He thought his money made him invincible. He thought he could buy my silence. I lowered the microphone slightly, looking at the devastated faces of Bradley and Beatrice. But he severely underestimated who he married. I am a forensic accountant. I do not stay silent when I find fraud. I expose it. And this is the greatest, most despicable fraud this family has ever committed. The truth hung heavily in the air, completely suffocating the opulent birthday gala. The massive medical document continued to glow brightly on the screen, a permanent, undeniable monument to Bradley's absolute ruin. He had tried to steal his father's empire with a lie, and I had just burned his entire world to the ground with the undeniable truth. The immediate aftermath of my revelation hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. The absolute silence that had gripped the room shattered, replaced by a deafening roar of overlapping voices. The wealthy elites, the country club board members, the politicians, and the corporate titans all began talking at once. They pointed at the massive projection on the screen, then at the pathetic figure of Bradley still pinned by David, and finally at Beatrice, who was shrinking back against the stage podium. The social execution was absolute. In this specific circle of high society, financial ruin was a scandal, but fabricating a bloodline to steal a generational fortune was an unforgivable sin. The guests physically backed away from the stage, treating Beatrice and Bradley as if they carried a highly contagious disease. I kept my eyes locked on Edward. The patriarch of the family sat frozen in his high-backed velvet chair. His face had transitioned from a mottled crimson to an ash gray. The deep lines around his mouth deepened as his eyes darted back and forth across the medical document illuminated above him. He was a man who had built an entire identity on the superiority of his lineage. He had demanded male heirs. He had dangled $50 million as the ultimate reward for securing his legacy. Now he was being forced to swallow the bitter reality that his only son was not a king in waiting, but a barren, manipulative thief who had treated him like a gullible fool. Edward slowly pushed himself up from his chair. His movements were stiff, vibrating with an ancient, terrifying wrath. He did not look at me. He bypassed me entirely and walked directly toward his wife. Beatrice saw him approaching, and her carefully constructed aristocratic facade completely collapsed. She raised her trembling hands, her diamond bracelets clinking nervously against each other. "Edward," she stammered, her voice thin and desperate over the noise of the crowd. "Edward, you cannot believe this woman. She forged that document. She is a vindictive, unstable liar trying to destroy our family because Bradley was divorcing her." Edward stopped inches from his wife. He looked down at her with a gaze so entirely devoid of warmth, it could have frozen water. "How long did you know?" Edward demanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the immediate attention of everyone within a 20-foot radius. Beatrice swallowed hard, taking a step back until her spine hit the wooden podium. I do not know what you mean. I never knew anything about this nonsense. Do not lie to me, Beatrice. Edward snarled, leaning closer. The medical report on that screen is from the exact same private rehabilitation clinic you insisted we send him to 12 years ago. You handled his admission. You handled his discharge. You managed all his private medical files to prevent a public scandal. You knew his drug abuse had made him completely sterile. You knew it for over a decade. Beatrice shook her head frantically, but the sheer panic in her eyes betrayed her. She was caught. She had orchestrated the entire illusion because she was terrified of losing her own proximity to the $50 million trust. She knew Edward would cut Bradley off if he failed to produce an heir, and by extension, her own influence and unlimited access to the family fortune would be severely diminished. You helped him plan this. Edward continued, his voice rising in volume, carrying across the silent sections of the ballroom. You watched me set up the trust fund. You watched me demand a grandson. You sat next to me at Thanksgiving dinners and smiled while you both plotted to pass off donor babies as my own flesh and blood. You made a complete mockery of my legacy just to keep your hands on my checkbook. I did it for you. Beatrice shrieked, tears ruining her expensive makeup. I did it because you put impossible pressure on him. You demanded an heir. You made him feel like a failure. We just wanted to give you what you wanted so you would finally be proud of him. You did it for the money. Edward roared, his voice booming through the microphone Nora had left resting on the podium. You are a parasite, Beatrice. Edward turned his back on his weeping wife. He walked slowly across the stage toward his son. David maintained his firm grip on Bradley, but shifted slightly to allow the patriarch room to confront the broken man. Bradley looked up at his father, his face streaked with sweat and tears. He looked entirely pathetic, stripped of his corporate titles, his stolen wealth, and his arrogant swagger. Dad, please. Bradley sobbed, his voice cracking. I can explain. It was just a business decision. The company needed the capital from the trust. I was trying to secure our empire. I was doing it for the family name. The family name, Edward repeated, as if the words physically disgusted him. You have no right to speak of the family name. You embezzled millions from your own shareholders. You let your mistress steal their pensions. You tried to buy a woman children like they were real estate assets. And you tried to trick me into handing over $50 million to a genetic stranger. Bradley fell to his knees as David released his grip. He grabbed the hem of his father-tailored suit jacket. Dad, I am your son. You cannot just abandon me. The federal agents raided my office today. I have absolutely nothing left. If you do not unlock the trust fund to help me pay the legal fees, I am going to federal prison. Edward looked down at the weeping man clinging to his jacket. He reached down, grasped Bradley's wrists, and forcefully peeled his son's hands away from the fabric. You are not my son. Edward stated, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. A son respects his father. A son honors his lineage. You are a common thief and a fraud. Edward turned to face the audience, looking out at the stunned crowd of billionaires, politicians, and socialites. Let it be known to everyone in this room, the patriarch announced, his voice steady and absolute. Bradley is hereby formally disowned from this family. He is completely severed from all familial enterprises, properties, and legal protections. The ballroom remained dead silent, absorbing the historic destruction of a corporate prince. Furthermore, Edward continued, looking back at Bradley, who was sobbing into his hands on the stage floor. The $50 million generational trust fund is permanently dissolved as of this exact moment. You will not receive a single penny of my money to fight your federal indictments. You will face the consequences of your monumental stupidity completely on your own. You are dead to me, Bradley. You are dead to this entire dynasty. Do not ever approach me again. The final domino had fallen. Nora watched as the ultimate consequence crashed down upon the man who had tried to discard her. The absolute finality of Edward's declaration hung heavily in the air. Bradley had lost his freedom to the federal government. He had lost his company to Nora. And now he had lost his father's fortune and his entire identity. The destruction was comprehensive, poetic, and entirely self-inflicted. Nora felt Claire step up beside her, wrapping a supportive arm around her waist. They did not need to say a word. The look of pure, unadulterated devastation on Bradley's face was all the closure they would ever need. The heavy velvet curtains behind the stage seemed to absorb the silence that followed Edward's departure. The patriarch walked down the side steps and disappeared into the crowd, leaving his son utterly abandoned on the hardwood floor. Bradley remained on his knees for a long, agonizing minute. The reality of his complete destruction was finally penetrating his thick layer of narcissism. He had no company. He had no trust fund. He had no father. The federal government was currently dismantling his office, and he was facing years behind bars. Slowly, Bradley raised his head. His eyes locked onto me. The pathetic, weeping facade melted away, revealing the raw, unhinged monster hiding underneath. His face contorted into a mask of pure, primal hatred. In his twisted mind, he was not responsible for his own actions. He did not blame his greed, his infidelity, or his reckless embezzlement. He blamed me. I was the one who refused to be discarded quietly. I was the one who exposed the truth. "You ruined my life," Bradley hissed, the words dripping with venom. His voice was a low, terrifying growl that escalated into a frantic scream. "You ruined everything." He scrambled to his feet. Just a few yards away, a silver catering cart held a display of vintage crystal champagne bottles. Bradley lunged toward the cart. His hand wrapped around the neck of a heavy, unopened bottle. He hoisted it into the air like a club. The green glass caught the light of the chandeliers as he charged directly at me, his face twisted in a murderous rage. Screams erupted from the front rows of the audience. Guests scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and dropping their expensive drinks in a frantic attempt to escape the sudden violence. I did not run. I did not even take a step back. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the man who was trying to strike me down. I knew I was completely safe because I knew exactly who was standing beside me. David moved with the fluid, calculated precision of a man who spent his life operating in high-pressure emergencies. He did not shout. He did not panic. As Bradley closed the distance, swinging the heavy crystal bottle downward with lethal intent, David stepped smoothly into his path. It was not a brawl. It was a surgical takedown. David shifted his weight, sidestepping the frantic arc of the heavy bottle. With lightning speed, he clamped his large hand onto Bradley's wrist, redirecting the violent momentum forward. David pivoted his hips and applied a sharp, specialized pressure to the joint. Bradley let out a sharp yelp of pain as his fingers involuntarily opened. The champagne bottle slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the hardwood stage and shattering into 100 glittering pieces, sending a spray of expensive foam across the polished floor. Before Bradley could even process the loss of his weapon, David completed the maneuver. He swept his leg behind Bradley's knees and forced him downward. Bradley hit the floor hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a harsh gasp. In one continuous motion, David pinned him face down against the stage. He drove his knee squarely between Bradley's shoulder blades, holding the disgraced executive flat against the wood, and twisted Bradley's arms securely up behind his back. Bradley thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities and kicking his expensive leather shoes against the floor, but it was entirely useless. David held him with effortless, terrifying strength. "Do not move another inch," David commanded. His voice was a calm, steady rumble that cut straight through Bradley's hysterical screaming. "If you try to fight me, I will break your arm. Keep your face on the floor." The violent outburst had taken less than 10 seconds from start to finish. The entire ballroom was staring in absolute shock at the sight of the former corporate prince pinned to the ground like a common street thug in a puddle of spilled champagne. Beatrice, who had been watching the scene unfold from the corner of the stage, finally broke. The last shred of her aristocratic dignity evaporated. Her son was a sterile fraud who had just committed an aggravated assault in front of the wealthiest families in the city. Her husband had publicly disowned them. Her social standing was permanently eradicated. She let out a loud, wretched wail and collapsed onto the stage. She crumpled into a weeping, humiliated heap, hiding her face in her hands, as the terrible reality of her new life set in. There was no coming back from this. She was entirely ruined. I looked down at the man groveling at my feet. Bradley was crying again, his cheek pressed against the wet wood, his breath hitching in pathetic, shallow gasps. The bespoke Italian suit he wore was covered in dust and champagne. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a weak, desperate coward, stripped of the wealth that had always shielded him from the consequences of his actions. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom burst open. The country club security team rushed in, followed closely by 4 uniformed police officers. Richard Harrington had made the emergency call the moment Beatrice had seized the microphone, anticipating that the situation might rapidly deteriorate. The officers marched quickly down the center aisle, their hands resting on their duty belts. They climbed the stairs to the stage. David calmly explained the situation, maintaining his secure hold until the lead officer was in position. David stepped back, smoothing his tuxedo jacket, looking completely unbothered by the physical exertion. The police officers hauled Bradley roughly to his feet. He offered no resistance this time. He just hung his head, his shoulders shaking as the officers pulled his arms behind his back. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed across the silent room. It was a beautiful, defining sound. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon," the lead officer stated firmly, reading Bradley his rights as they turned him toward the exit. I watched them march him away. An assault charge of this magnitude was a violent felony. When the federal agents at the Internal Revenue Service added this arrest to his impending indictments for massive corporate tax evasion and offshore embezzlement, no judge in the country would grant him bail. He was a documented flight risk who had just demonstrated extreme physical violence. He was going straight to a federal holding cell. He would not see the outside world for a very long time. The police officers escorted the weeping Beatrice out right behind him, advising her that she needed to leave the premises immediately. The grand birthday gala had completely transformed into a spectacular crime scene. I turned and looked at Claire and David. We had walked into the lion's den, and we were walking out as the absolute conquerors. The nightmare was officially over. 1 year later, the oppressive darkness of that country club ballroom felt like a lifetime away. I sat on a woven blanket in the middle of a sunlit park, watching the autumn leaves drift slowly toward the grass. The air was crisp and completely free of the suffocating tension that used to define my everyday existence. Today was a celebration of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the twins' first birthday. My boys, healthy and vibrant, were currently attempting to smash their small fists into a towering chocolate cake. Claire was snapping dozens of photographs with her professional camera, laughing as frosting flew across the picnic blanket. David sat beside me, expertly catching a flying piece of cake before it hit his casual weekend sweater. We were surrounded by genuine friends, colleagues from my new firm, and the family I had actively chosen. There were no manipulative patriarchs demanding loyalty. There were no toxic expectations. There was only love, respect, and the beautiful chaos of 2 toddlers discovering sugar for the first time. The path to this sunlit park had been paved with the absolute destruction of the people who tried to bury me. The justice system, often slow and cumbersome, moved with terrifying efficiency when presented with a fully documented roadmap of corporate fraud. Bradley never saw the outside of a jail cell after the police dragged him out of the gala in handcuffs. The aggravated assault charge was the immediate lock on his cage, but the Internal Revenue Service provided the reinforced steel bars. The federal audit I triggered tore through his commercial real estate empire like a hurricane. Investigators uncovered years of systematic tax evasion, offshore money laundering, and gross embezzlement. Stripped of his father-generational trust fund and completely abandoned by his expensive legal team, Bradley had absolutely no defense. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who once wore bespoke Italian suits and believed he could buy human beings like properties was now wearing a standard-issue uniform entirely stripped of his name, his wealth, and his freedom. Gemma did not fare any better. When the federal agents froze her offshore accounts, her entire world collapsed. She tried to turn state evidence against Bradley, offering to testify in exchange for immunity. But the forensic accounting ledger I projected in that boardroom provided irrefutable proof that she had actively stolen millions from the shareholder pension funds. The Department of Justice does not grant immunity to primary architects of wire fraud. Gemma took a plea deal to avoid a 20-year sentence, but she was still handed 7 years in a federal correctional facility for women. Her desperate climb up the social ladder ended at the absolute bottom. Perhaps the most poetic justice of all belonged to Beatrice. After the catastrophic humiliation at the country club, Edward completely severed her from his vast fortune. He filed for divorce the very next morning, citing severe marital misconduct and fraud. Beatrice was entirely excommunicated from the high society circles she worshipped. Her wealthy friends blocked her number. The charity boards she once ruled immediately voted to remove her name from their registries. Without Edward unlimited capital to fund her lavish lifestyle, she was forced to vacate her sprawling penthouse. I heard through the legal grapevine that she is now living in a tiny, outdated condominium on the outskirts of the city, surviving on a meager alimony stipend that barely covers her basic expenses. The woman who once judged everyone by their zip code was now completely invisible to the world she valued above her own family. As for me, I did not just survive the wreckage of my marriage, I conquered it. Armed with the legally binding contract Bradley had so arrogantly signed in my hospital room, I executed a flawless liquidation of his remaining viable assets. I worked directly with the board of directors to compensate the shareholders who had been robbed, securing a massive legally ironclad payout for my forensic services and the surrender of my voting shares. I took that capital and built my own empire. I opened a premier forensic accounting firm located right in the heart of the financial district. My reputation preceded me. Corporate boards and wealthy investors hired my firm to audit their executives, knowing I possessed the ruthless capability to dismantle corruption from the inside out. I became the exact kind of professional terror that men like Bradley feared the most. I had millions in legally acquired, completely clean assets. I had full, uncontested legal and physical custody of my sons. I had everything Bradley tried to take from me, multiplied tenfold. I looked over at the boys. They were happily covered in chocolate, giggling as David scooped them up, one in each arm, spinning them around in the warm afternoon sun. Claire leaned her head against my shoulder, offering a quiet, content smile. This was my dynasty. It was not built on toxic bloodlines, forced ultimatums, or hidden offshore accounts. It was built on absolute truth, fierce loyalty, and the unbreakable bond of people who actually protected each other. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, silver-framed photograph I had kept specifically for today. It was a picture of the boys taken just moments after they were born, back when I was terrified, exhausted, and completely unaware of the absolute war I was about to wage. I traced the edge of the frame, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my entire spirit. The nightmare was truly permanently over. He told me to take $3 million and leave my children. So I took the $3 million, took his company, took his freedom, and kept my kids. Some contracts once signed cost you your entire life. The story of Nora's strategic triumph over her narcissistic husband, Bradley, offers a profound lesson on the nature of power and liberation. True strength lies in calculated composure and meticulous preparation, rather than emotional reactivity. When faced with the ultimate betrayal, a husband attempting to purchase her newborn children and discard her like a mere transaction, Nora could have easily succumbed to despair or screaming rage. Bradley and his mother Beatrice banked on that exact reaction. They expected tears, hysteria, and eventual submission, utilizing their extreme wealth and status as weapons to force her compliance. Instead, Nora demonstrated that the most effective response to toxic manipulation is a cold, rational counterstrike. She leveraged her expertise as a forensic accountant to quietly dismantle Bradley's empire from the inside out. This narrative teaches us that toxic individuals thrive on emotional chaos. It is the currency they use to confuse their victims and maintain control. By refusing to play their game, Nora starved them of their power. She painstakingly gathered undeniable evidence, set unyielding boundaries, and executed her exit strategy with flawless precision. While we may not all face multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement schemes, the underlying principle is universally applicable. When confronted with betrayal, gaslighting, or manipulation, our greatest defense is stepping back, anchoring ourselves in the truth, and protecting our peace. Seeking validation or genuine apologies from those incapable of empathy is a losing battle. True justice is found not in changing their minds, but in completely removing their access to your life and succeeding on your own terms. Nora did not just survive her toxic marriage, she conquered it by weaponizing the truth against those who tried to bury it. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own relationships and dare to cut ties with anyone who consistently diminishes your true worth.